What's the title of your most recent book, and what's it about?
Technocracy Rising. Subtitle: The Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. Transformation is a buzzword today in the global elite circles. That's what's happening to our world. And Technocracy Rising is literally about the rise of technocracy, replacement economic system from the 1930s to sweep across the entire world.
Why did you write the book?
I wrote Technocracy Rising because it had to be written. It was a topic that was virtually unknown. The historical movement of technocracy was largely undiscovered in modern times, and yet when I discovered it had tremendous significance to current affairs, I knew that the story absolutely had to be written. And this was in lieu somewhat of my idea of writing a final book, Trilaterals over Washington, Volume 3, which would have completed a trilogy. But I decided not to do that this story of technocracy was much, much more important than merely describing the actions, the current actions of the Trilateral Commission, bringing things up to date in the last 40 years and so on. And it does all that in addition in the book Technocracy Rising. But I do believe that the concept of technocracy in today's modern world is the singular most important concept that people have missed and also that people need to get a hold of.
How would you define freedom?
Freedom. Well, freedom and liberty are closely related topics. And some people would define freedom as just the ability to do whatever the heck you want to do. And I suppose there's merit in that, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else and you don't intrude on another person's rights to freedom as well. But I think in a larger context, freedom in a society has a little bit different concept than a freedom as an individual. We certainly need freedoms as individuals. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence guarantees it to us. But in a societal sense, freedom and liberty have the context of being able to operate together and live in live in close proximity to each other, to monitor the affairs of society in such a way that people have a maximized number of choices on what they can do with their lives, what they want to do with their lives, the right to self-determination as either a family or as an individual or as a group of people, without tromping on the rights of other people and damaging their property, damaging their ability to do what they want to do. And there's limits to that. For instance, if people come into society and want to destroy that society altogether by force, for instance, the recent ISIS attacks down in Texas is a good case in point. Should we allow people like ISIS to exercise free speech in our country if that speech is specifically designed to destroy our country? I think not. I think not. But liberty and freedom are things that are ingrained in the Constitution of our nation. They're ingrained, I believe, in our heritage. We've had lots of close calls over the decades where it looked like it was going to be curtains, yet it wasn't, and we're still here.
What's the most important concept to realize in terms of technocracy for an average reader of your book?
The most important and shocking part of technocracy is that it's not a political system. It was defined as an economic system. It's a big difference here. Now, obviously, economics and politics are closely related in some sense. But our political system in our country, our public, based on a Congress, based on a Senate, the House of Representatives, executive branch being separate from Congress, the judiciary being separate from both. We have a political system in our country that appropriately supports the economic system that we know as free enterprise and kind of a larger sense as capitalism. Not to be confused, by the way, with crony capitalism or other aberrations of capitalism. But the economic system is different than the political system. And technocracy was defined originally in the 1930s as an economic system, not as a political system. These scientists and engineers who started this eschewed the political system in our country. They didn't like politicians. They felt they had no need, that they were blundering idiots trying to control and make policies for technology that they did not understand. In fact, they blamed the Great Depression on these same politicians because they felt that they had done things with technology and society that resulted in everything falling apart. That was a false read, by the way, on their part, I do believe, but nevertheless, that's the way they felt back then. And there's a general feeling of that today, that the political structure of this country is immaterial, the Congress is irrelevant, and that the scientists and engineers should just simply do what's right in their own eyes to manage and control society at large. And it's also important to remember that when we talk about the economic system versus political system, that technocracy is a global movement today. It's not just centered in America. We have a particular political system in our country, but other countries don't have our system. For instance, China still has the vestiges of a communist dictatorship, a totalitarian dictatorship in its country, and yet China is now being classified by many writers as a pure technocracy. They're going in that direction of an economic system based on the original technocracy that we find in the 1930s, the economic system. In fact, technocracy as a historical system works better in a totalitarian system, form of government, than it would in a democratic or republican form of government that we have here in America. So looking at it as an economic system is covering the globe with a common interest, and yet there are many different political systems and systems of governance throughout the world that aren't the same. It's not the same as ours. Europe is different, Russia is different, China is different. The countries in South America and Africa and so on have quite varied forms of governance of the people. There's an economic coup that's taking place in the world today, an economic transformation, and the people that are bringing this to us want to control society, if you will, as a factory, kind of like a factory or a machine floor, where you have a factory making something, and the engineers have designed the factory, and they're going to manage every little part of the factory from their perspective as a scientific project. Crazy as it sounds, it's social engineering on steroids.
It sounds like Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
Well, somewhat. There's been lots of descriptions of utopia over the last, I'll say, 100 years, and they all fit to some extent. Technocracy, as originally described in the 1930s, truly was a utopian system of operation. We have an example in literature of the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Huxley's book, scary as it was, science fiction knowledge that that described a scientific dictatorship where every little facet of life was managed down to the last little detail. And what people don't appreciate is that book was written in 1932. The only thing on the world stage at that point that even remotely fit that book was technocracy, and he was looking into the face of technocracy when he wrote the book. He got his inspiration from it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to turn out exactly that way, but you hear today in the media, and you hear people talking about it just in passing. Oh, it's a brave new world we live in these days. Well, they don't realize how true that is. The brave new world that they're talking about was looking straight into the face of technocracy in the 1930s. And those ideas have stuck, and they're striking a chord with people today. They're not sure why, but those that have read the book say, oh man, it sure looks like Brave New World to me.
Well, Huxley, if you go forward with his brother Julian, you've got UNESCO and the Humanist Manifesto. He was co-author of that, I thought, in 1933. The United Nations. So that's eugenics, that's British eugenics going forward. And if you went backwards in his history, you've got T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. So around technocracy, you've got this whole idea of eugenics, you've got Fabian socialists. There's a lot of common threads running through there. And I can't help but notice the parallels between 1932, Brave New World, and a 1919 novel from a guy named Yevgeny Zamyatin in Russia. So there was other parts of the world that were kind of also describing how there's a certain group of scientists who are seeking to control population, and different artists were writing that. Now, I think Brave New World was definitely written from a position of, this is a foreshadowing of what they wanted to do. And Aldous Huxley was the teacher of not H.G. Wells, he was a tutor of Aldous Huxley, Huxley's student was Orwell. So there's also an ominous chain of continuity between Darwin, the Huxleys, H.G. Wells, George Orwell, and all these caricatures, if you will, of tyranny that got brought about into his formalized course. How would you define technocracy?
Well, as a replacement economic system, the differentiator was that they wanted to do away with price-based economics altogether, and that means capitalism. They wanted to destroy capitalism. Well, actually, they didn't want to destroy it. They just believed it was already dead. The Great Depression was a very dark time. Unemployment was through the roof, food lines, extending around blocks. Finding a job was just next to impossible. A lot of hunger, a lot of just hard times. And so a lot of people really believed capitalism was dead. And the thing that differentiated technocracy from anything else was that the scientists and engineers believed that the perfect economy would be based on energy rather than on money and supply and demand. This is a very difficult concept for people in America, or probably anywhere, to get their head around, because when you talk about doing it with money and pricing everything in energy, it just doesn't make sense. It goes snap. But here's just an example of how it might work. They would forecast. They intended to forecast the amount of energy that was going to be produced in any given period, like say a month. They would forecast the energy to be produced in that given month in the economic system that was being looked at. They would divide that energy by the number of people, and they would devise a system of energy currency, energy credits that would be passed out, kind of like food stamps, to everybody in society. And you'd have those energy credits to spend during the following month. At the end of the month, your energy credits would expire if you had not spent them, so it's, spend them or lose them. And you'd have to wait for a new allocation for the following month, again based on another forecast of the energy that's going to be produced in that period. Then on the other hand, how would you buy goods and services? Well, you go down to let's say go down to a clothing store to buy a shirt. The technocrats, the science and engineers, believed that they would be able to price that shirt in terms of the energy that it took to make it. So you have cotton grown in Egypt, you have diesel goes into a tractor, you have the cotton gin comes along and has to spin it into thread, and then it goes to a garment maker in Sri Lanka, another ship involved, and eventually it ends up in your store, wherever your town is, in a department store, and you go in and buy the shirt. Theoretically, there's you could add up all the energy it took to make that shirt. That's what you'd pay. And wouldn't be based on supply and demand at all. It'd just be based on the amount of energy it took to make that shirt. So this is completely otherworldly to our system that we understand as free enterprise, supply and demand, and so on. And it also requires a management of the economy that we do not appreciate today at all. We don't have anything like this in today's economic world. Now, there have been attempts to manage capitalism in different ways, by the way. I'll say that the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance, when communism really got underway as a social experiment, the government attempted to manage the capitalistic system. Same thing happened with fascism. Well, the corporate world merged with the government, and they tried to manage the economy. But in both cases, it was still a price-based economy. It was still supply and demand, even though the government said, we'll manage the economy. We'll tell you how much supply there's going to be. We'll tell you how much demand there can be. And when technocracy came along, the whole concept of all of those things were out the door. It was an altogether different ballgame. In fact, if you were to meet a card-carrying technocrat in the 1930s and call him a communist, you're liable to get into a fist fight with them because they hated communism. They thought that communism was a complete sellout. It was just another iteration of capitalism, and people trying to manage and manipulate capitalism to control the people. Technocracy, they thought, would do away with that altogether.
What was the Technocracy study course at King's College, New York?
The Technocracy study course became the technocrats' Bible, if you will, for how they intended to transform the world into a technocracy economic system. It was written primarily by a young geophysicist by the name of M. King Hubbard. The other co-founder of Technocracy Incorporated was a guy by the name of Howard Scott. And I might add, even though Technocracy Incorporated was started in 1934, the movement towards that end had covered at least the 20 years prior. There was lots of discussion that went on, lots of little groups that met. Technocracy as an ideology really got its kickstart when they became associated with Columbia University in 1932 and early 1933. And several of the prominent engineers and scientists at Columbia were actually part of technocracy at that point. Only until Howard Scott was exposed as being somewhat of a fraud did Columbia University drop kick them literally right out of the university. They said, get out and don't come back. And so there was a little time of turmoil there. Both Howard Scott and M. King Hubbard, they happened to be roommates at the time because Scott was broke. They got together the next year and they started this organization called Technocracy Incorporated. It was a membership organization. They incorporated in New York. Both their signatures were on the incorporation papers. And then they proceeded to spread the gospel, if you will, of technocracy far and wide. In order to do that, they knew that they had to document their economic system. They did so through the Technocracy Study course. It was a 8.5 by 11 type booklet meant to be a workbook for people to use in study groups around the country, and they did. But they went to great lengths to describe exactly how technocracy would work. And that book is still around even today. You can find it, scanned copies of it on the internet, and you can also buy it still being produced by, in fact, Technocracy Incorporated is still alive. It's still incorporated today. Their headquarters happens to be up in the very, very northern part of Washington State, close to the Canadian border. I visited there and got some information from them, actually. So the organization is still around. The book is still around, Technocracy Study Course, and as I said, there's also a scanned version out there on the internet that people can get and read if they're curious.
In what ways, if there are any ways, does the Technocracy Study Course relate to today's mass surveillance culture?
Absolutely. The specifications of technocracy included control over energy, much like we have smart grid today, with the smart meters that are going on the sides of homes and businesses all over America, and indeed all over the world. You have the Total Awareness Society today, with all of the breakdown in personal privacy and the roll-up of consumer data, if you will, into massive databases like are being collected by the NSA and others. And we see all of the genesis of these ideas back in the original technocracy documents. The problem is they did not have the technology at the time to do what they wanted to do, and I think they knew that. It was just an idea, the idea of utopia, that they felt that technology eventually would bail them out. It didn't happen maybe quite as fast as they thought, but here we are today, and we see these things being implemented today almost in lockstep with the original document. We also had evidence to support the fact that technocracy, when it was housed at Columbia University for a short period of time, shared the basement in Hamilton Hall. There was only one hall back then at Columbia. It was called Hamilton Hall. But it had a full footprint basement to the building. And they used that for temporary projects to loan to people, if you will, that wanted to do something to come in. And so they gave technocracy part of that basement space to operate for a time. The other side of that space was occupied by IBM, the early vestiges of IBM. Ostensibly, that's where they built one of their very first tabulators. And so there was an interaction between people like M. King Hubbard, who was a geophysicist, trained, educated geophysicist, and the computer science guys that were developing this tabulator. And so I expect there were some futuristic discussions between those people, like, well, where is computing going? What can we do with it? And when the rise of Nazi Germany, National Socialism began to take place in Europe, IBM was one of the very first vendors that went to the German government and sold, or leased, actually, they never sold anything, they leased many of their tabulators to the German government for the sake of doing statistical analysis and things like that, scheduling trains and other nefarious things. And it wasn't by a surprise either that technocracy also jumped the Atlantic Ocean and showed up in Nazi Germany as well. Not necessarily hand in hand with IBM, but they had some of the shared blood and ideas, if you will, I think, by the time they actually just got out of Columbia University and went beyond it. There's very little evidence at this point, unfortunately, of those early days of IBM at Columbia University, even though we know they were there. The archives of the historical archives have been removed from the Columbia library system, so nobody knows where they are at this point.
Well, what I'm hearing is that there's an organization that has jumped national boundaries, that was interested in at least analyzing the human resources, natural resources on the planet, and they had aims that they couldn't really do through technology yet. And now, that when you were talking about that, it reminds me of a book that Brzezinski wrote, USA and USSR, and it was comparing the two cultures. And in there, he was talking about his experience studying East Germany. And he said they were able to collect massive amounts of information on people, which is cybernetics, but they weren't able to put it into use because they lacked the technical power then. He was predicting then, I think this book was 72 maybe, that this is what they needed to do to go forward. So a lot of the tenets that I see in Brzezinski's work are also found in the Technocracy study course, and Brzezinski went to Columbia. And there's also this undertone of not only sharing that information, the technocracy vibe with the Germans, the Nazis, but there's also the Eugenics record office that was inspiring some of the talks that Hitler gave. So there's also this, people who seek to control other people, there's a lot of various means that are used to do that. But it seems like technocracy was a way to join all those ways and for people to use reason in unreasonable ways.
Yes, there was. The whole field of eugenics really got its start in earnest in California. Kind of figures, I guess. California seems to lead the way on everything. and Hitler actually modeled a lot of his eugenics program after California's eugenics program. I found no evidence, however, that the people involved in technocracy were directly involved in the eugenics movement, except just by simple overlap. It wasn't nearly as big, for instance, at Columbia University as it was in California at that time. However, time-wise, the eugenics movement overlapped technocracy perfectly. And so it's certain that some of the technocrats, at least, probably were also very heavily into the eugenics movement as well. But not as an organizational issue, they understand. They never wrote about it. For instance, Technocracy study course doesn't really address eugenics head on. But some of the people involved in it may well have written some things outside, in their own time, if you will, about the eugenics movement. But they fit quite well, hand in glove, I might add, because, managing, from a scientist perspective, an engineer's perspective, managing society, to them, is a lot like managing a giant feedlot of cattle. Say you have 50,000 cattle and all these pens, and you have to mix food for them scientifically. You've got all the bins, and you load the food on the truck, and you take it out and deliver it just in time for breakfast, and lunch, and dinner, and snacks in between, so they get nice and fat. And the cattle get weighed. The cattle get shot up with different drugs and antibiotics and whatever. But the whole process is to get those cattle in that feedlot to the market, ultimately to be butchered, turned into steaks and hamburger and so on. Not that they're trying to make food out of us. That's not what I'm saying. But this is the way a feedlot is managed. You have to have means of control and monitoring of that feedlot in order to be a good feedlot operator. And so it's an engineering problem. And so the engineers that looked at society and said, hey, this is just, looks just like a big old factory floor to us, or it looks like a big old feedlot or whatever, it begs to be managed. And so we'll use our scientific prowess and our scientific method to figure out ways to engineer society and, make it much more efficient. You hear the word efficiency all the time in the writings. and make sure that the resources are balanced, that we don't strip the earth dry of all its natural resources. This is what we hear in sustainable development today, everywhere you turn. As you know, it's about conserving resources and so on, balancing resource usage to consumption or to manufacture. So you know, it's kind of a strange historical animal that had no institutional backing at the time, other than Columbia University. The Rockefellers didn't give money. Carnegie's didn't give money, the Mallows didn't give money. There was nobody that I saw around technocracy originally, other than the scientists and engineers doing it, that had any money. And both the founders, Howard Scott was dead broke, and so was M. King Hubbard. Although at least Hubbard had enough money to pay for an apartment where Scott roomed for some time because he was broke. So they had no grants. You know, they were just people with radical ideas. There were lots of radical ideas floating around in the 1910 through 1935. They had their piece of it. They had their little flag in the ground. And it wasn't until Brzezinski came along in 1970, writing his book Between Two Ages, subtitled America's Role in the Technotronic Era. It wasn't until that book came out that technocracy, if you will, was reborn, reinvigorated. I don't know how you'd call it. You know, but the themes and the patterns in Brzezinski's book very closely mirrored early technocracy. And I don't think it was a mistake that he was at Columbia University at that time. Not that he was indoctrinated by old scientists or something directly, but radical ideas tend to be discussed for a long period of time. And I'm sure that there were, in his stay there, I am sure that there were some interesting discussions in the cafeteria over the history of Columbia, you know, the crazy stuff that had come and gone, and you know, so people are going to be talking potentially about technocracy and the ideas of it. Brzezinski was a political scientist. I'm sure that interested him, and the history of it was right under his nose too. So why not take a look at it? So I think a lot of those ideas were picked up by Brzezinski, and now discovering technocracy 40 years later and looking backwards to see how they've implemented it, this is exactly what's been in their mind to do from day one when they originally called it, when the Trilateral Commission called it their new international economic order. We didn't understand what that meant at first. But that was it. This is it. Technocracy.
All these years later, is there any other legacy left behind by M. King Hubbard in the form of the greed agenda? What was his specific theory?
Yeah, Hubbard was an interesting guy. That's not to be confused in any way with L. Ron Hubbard, by the way. It's spelled differently. There's no relation. The names are completely different. Hubbard, and Hubbard.
Right.
So M. King Hubbard was a geophysicist, and he left the Technocracy Inc. movement, but never renounced technocracy. He left it, I think, because as he went to work in the corporate world, you know, for the big oil companies and stuff, that it really didn't help his career to be part of Technocracy Inc. Incorporated. So he left the movement, but he never left the philosophy. It was Hubbard who, in 1954, created the theory, or proposed the theory, what we know today as peak oil theory. It was more often called Hubbard's peak in those days. And he talked about it, wrote about it quite prolifically. It basically stated that the reserves in the world were going to max out, oil reserves were going to max out, that there's a finite limit to them, and that the consumption of energy was going to increase, and at some point those curves would cross, and then all heck would break loose, because energy production would decline, energy usage would increase, and you know, this was really kind of the first strong suggestion of what happens if there's an imbalance between consumption and production. That is what the Earth has to provide in any case. Hubbard didn't know it maybe at the time, but later he became one of the founders, you know, the fathers of the faith, so to speak, of the eco movement. The whole business of you know, conserving Earth's resources, sustainable development, those sorts of things. And almost any movements you look at that have to do with ecology, you'll find them taking or giving credit to people like M. King Hubbard as being one of their founding, members, philosophy members. And so Hubbard finally passed, and his legacy lives on today.
Before Hubbard, there was a British character named Jan Smuts who wrote a book called Holism and Evolution. How would that play into today's green agenda?
Well, the concept of holism, as proposed by Smuts, was it wasn't officially incorporated as a doctrine, if you will, into early technocracy writings, but the concept had influence over, I think, almost universally over all the people that were part of technocracy. It's just that they didn't write about it and include it in the doctrine per se. But the idea of holism, as proposed by Smuts, is that each person, each entity, a societal entity, is a member of a larger societal entity as well. Like an individual is part of a family is part of a community is part of a town is part of a district, so on up the line, part of the state, states are part of nations are part of the global planet. And Smuts proposed that no matter where you were in this holonic structure, that your real responsibility was to the greater holon, the greater entity that you were part of, all the way to the planetary level. That you were part of that great holon in the earth. I'd say the great holon in the sky, but the great holon in the earth, I guess. And so a person didn't find his identity and his value as a person, but only as the value would come only in his relation to the other holons above him. This is antithetic to the way we think in America, where our Declaration of Independence very clearly says that we as people have intrinsic value just because we're human, just because we're born human with unalienable rights. And that we don't have a responsibility to, quote unquote, serve the greater good. Rather, we are guaranteed things like the pursuit of life, life, liberty, and happiness, the pursuit of happiness. And so the idea of Smuts' holarchy really struck a chord with all of these progressive groups, and I think in particular probably with technocracy, because as they set up their system, it very much mimicked this holarchy system, where you had all the different components being, serving the greater components above them, until you get to in fact, even the organizational chart, that is the technocracy organizational chart of the North American continent, resembled the holon idea, where everybody down on the lower on the ladder would serve the people above. It's a dangerous concept, a dangerous philosophy. We see it all around us today in various forms. Movies have been made supporting this idea. Where'd they get the idea? I don't know if they read Smuts, but it's just everywhere. It's all around us.
Well, and some of the other ideas that had taken root in Germany, aside from technocracy, were creating one of the worst periods in 20th century history. And so it's not just, their use of technology to try to govern and control people. There's also some corrupt reasoning. There's some racist philosophy. It's like a melting pot. It's like it was somebody's experiment that they couldn't conduct in their own country. And so you had American and British, and I'm sure other countries that were contributing to the corporate infrastructure underneath of Nazi Germany, like IBM. Mm-hmm. And so is there anything else you have to offer on the Nazis' use of technocracy? Because then my next question is going to go toward technocracy and Operation Paperclip. Right.
Yeah, technocracy in Germany was interesting. The Germans they're very different than Americans. It's an understatement. But Germans have always had an idea of if it's not invented here, it doesn't exist. And when technocracy became a viable movement in Germany, There was a number of people, engineers and scientists, that adhered to technocracy. They repented. They weren't organizationally connected to the American counterpart, but they reprinted all the articles from the journals over here. They translated and reprinted them in German. So there was obviously, they were in sync with each other, even if they weren't organizationally connected. But the organization of technocracy ran afoul with Hitler when he finally realized that he just really didn't want any other organizations around that might upstage him. So he basically just outlawed the technocracy organization. I'm sure he just viewed it as competition.
Competition's a sin.
But that did not stop the technocrats from operating within Nazi Germany over the entire course of the war. This was never recognized until recently. A German historian at a German university and wrote a book. The name of the book slips me right now, but he wrote a book and suggested that these technocrats had a profound impact on Hitler's Germany. All during the bad period of time when things really got dicey, during the Holocaust, for instance, and the technocrats were not supposed to be communicating with each other. They were embedded in all the various columns of power that Hitler had established. And nobody was really supposed to communicate between those columns of power because Hitler, being paranoid that he was, wanted to keep everybody in the dark as to what the other side was doing so he could control everybody. And he wouldn't get any rebellion that way, like people want to knock him off and take over the whole structure. But what this German historian found out is these technocrats continued to work within the German government, and that they actually communicated secretly amongst themselves all during this period of time. And at the end of the war, it was also interesting. And these were the people, by the way, that made the technology for Hitler to do what he did. These were the people who included, IBM and the machines they leased the tabulators they leased to Germany. This whole technocratic movement made possible, literally, what Hitler did. If it were not for them, he would not have succeeded. They communicated with each other during the war between columns of power. This is now a matter of history. It's been documented in Germany. And at the end of the war, you mentioned Operation Paperclip. At the end of the war, lots of interesting things happened. Most of the military people and some of the politicians went off to Nuremberg, got tried. Some of them died. Some of them got long prison terms. Many German people who were accused or would have been accused, they fled to other countries, like many in South America, Argentina, for instance. And Operation Paperclip was a top secret project back in those days. Only recently was declassified and written about extensively. There was a book actually earlier, I think it was last year, called Operation Paperclip. And what happened was that our government, under top secret operation, brought some 1,600 scientists and engineers from Germany, from Nazi Germany, back to the United States. These included the technocrats that were operating within the Nazi experience all during that period of time. They never faced Nuremberg. They never faced charges. They basically were brought over here on, to be sanitized, if you will, as far as reputation is concerned and history. And they were put into top positions in military research labs, in some universities under contract with the military, for instance. And they basically just went on with life as if nothing had happened in a different country. And this kind of brings up a principle that I see with technocrats in general. The technocrats and technocracy doesn't really care what political system it operates under. The political system is not the important thing to them. The methodology is. As long as their scientific method is being used, the political ends to which it's used really don't matter. It's just that you use the correct procedure to get there. That's why they had no problem, apparently, with the atrocious things that happened in Nazi Germany during the period of time. You say, well, do they have no conscience? Maybe some did, but a lot of them didn't. They saw no problem with aiding and abetting, the extermination of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And, we talk about, people talk about the Holocaust being about Jews, and it really was, but you know what? Hitler killed all the gypsies, he killed blacks, he killed Christians. I mean, this guy hated Jews for sure, but he was not a respecter of persons, that was the only target he had. He didn't like anybody that wasn't like him. I guess it's ironic that he wasn't even German. He was from Austria. But the Germans didn't take that into account at the time. But the German experience was really interesting with respect to technocracy, and that's one of the reasons that technocracy failed in the United States, is that people too easily associated the American technocracy movement with Nazi Germany, and they said, we don't want any part of that. In fact, in Canada, technocracy was outlawed as a subversive organization for about 2.5 years. That didn't help their reputation in America either, that Canada had outlawed them. They didn't outlaw them here in the States, but a lot of people started scratching their heads thinking, where there's smoke, there's fire. So we just, we don't want anything to do with those people.
So technocracy starts at Columbia, it jumps the ocean, it goes over to Germany, it comes back over here with Operation Paperclip, and then the CIA takes those technocrats, those Nazi technocrats, and start running MK Ultra. So I don't know how deep your research has gone into it, but there's a relationship between technocracy and MK Ultra, and what do you know?
Well, there is, and I'm not the expert on that, by the way. I'll just say that up front. But I have friends who know a lot about it, and most of the science. Let's just talk about the science of it without putting a moral value on it. A lot of the science that came out of the atrocities in Nazi Germany, the experiments on humans, some just so gross you just don't even want to talk about them. But that created a body of science. You understand the things that they did to people in the concentration camps, with no respect to life or limb. That body of science came back to the United States when these technocrats were repatriated. This is pure speculation, but I wonder if they had a reunion party amongst technocrats in the United States and the technocratic buddies from Germany. I could picture that happening. I have no evidence that it ever happened. But they were welcomed back into the scientific community here with open arms. And all that science, all that body of science from these experiments came back into the United States. And science doesn't just go poof and dissipate. Knowledge just doesn't go poof and dissipate. They brought it back in. It was part of their experience. It was part of their life. And even though they could not conduct additional experiments in the United States necessarily like they did in Nazi Germany, at least not so blatantly, it had a profound effect on a number of programs that the United States found itself operating with. And here we go. The technocrats don't care what political system they're under, as long as they can execute their trade.
Okay, I want to jump back and get a little of the historical context on these ideas. I would go back to the idea of Plato in his book, The Republic. There's a chapter on cybernetics and the art of steering and governing people. And they didn't have really technology back then other than words. So rhetoric was the technocracy back then. If you want to comment on that, and if not, jump to the first person in history, like Saint Simon, possibly, that you see picking these ideas up and running with them.
The ancient philosophy from people like Plato, they danced around the idea of social control a lot. Whether there was a hardcore technology that they were looking at using to implement that, other than just words, probably there wasn't a lot of technology that existed back then in the modern sense. These philosophies have melded together. They've combined with other philosophers along the way and stuff to bring about the melting pot, I think, that we had in the early 1900s. I think it really found a nexus there. A lot of these trains of thought the French philosophers, for instance, that were writing many radical things. They incorporated bits and pieces of philosophy to justify their own manipulative positions of society, and why society should be the way they say, not the way maybe society really ought to be. So you see this there was a melting pot of various ideas in the early 20s. Some of them took the form of humanism, some took the form of communism, some took the form of fascism and socialism and so on. And one of those prominent progressive thoughts in science was scientism. And scientism, as a philosophy, you can see some of like Plato's thinking in it, even though he didn't think it exactly this way. But the father of technocracy is widely reputed to be a French philosopher. No surprise, it's a French philosopher probably. He lived between 1760 and 1825. Didn't live a super long life, I guess. But he is considered to be the father of technocracy, modern technocracy. And his philosophy was this, relating to scientism. He says, and I quote, "A scientist, my dear friends, is a man who foresees. It is because science provides the means to predict that it is useful, and scientists are superior to all other men." Close quote. That's a dangerous philosophy, in my opinion. And there's multiple problems with this. Is a scientist actually able to foresee? Does he have a crystal ball? Does he really know the future? Well, if you're somebody like Al Gore, who says we're all going to die because of climate change, he's foretelling the future. He's bought into this lie that somehow he can foresee the future, and he's telling us, you better do it my way or you're all going to die. The second thing is that is wrong with a statement like this. Are scientists really superior to all other men? I would say no. They put their pants on just like the rest of us, the same way. They're men. They're subject to all the frailties of man and the mistakes of man. And they should never be elevated as some special class of superior men. This was very similar, by the way, not in terms of scientists, but it's very similar to what Hitler had in mind for the Aryan race. He said the Aryan race, that is the Germanic people, the blonde, blue-eyed, strong, muscular supermen, that they were superior to all other men. You see, that's what started that whole thing, that somehow they were superior. And scientists are not superior to all other men. So scientism as a philosophy, an elite of scientists and engineers is a very dangerous philosophy because they take it upon themselves to engineer all of society with no mandate from the people they're engineering, no input from the people they're engineering either. They're just doing it because they feel that they're enlightened.
Did Saint-Simon have any influence on communism and Marx and Engels, for instance?
I'm sure that he did. But on the other hand, only in the sense of a melting pot. I don't see a lot of direct input from Saint Simon into the writings of Karl Marx, for instance. But did it influence them to some extent? I expect it did. These were the things that were just being talked about in those days. They didn't have, if people didn't have televisions to entertain them, they didn't have, sports games to go to every day of the week. And what the intellectuals would do is they would read books, actually, and they would talk about those books, and they'd debate philosophies and ideas and stuff like that, and they'd come up with their own ideas out of hammering the other ones together. And I expect that Saint Simon was an influential French philosopher even in those days, and he was regarded. His number one disciple, by the way, was Auguste Comte, and he's known as the father of sociology. for instance, even today in college. You go to any sociology department and read about the history of sociology, the first name you're going to come across is Auguste Comte. So, they were influential, for sure. But, did everybody take them in lockstep? No. But the technocrats really revered St. Simon. They do to this day.
Who came up with these ideas of positivism?
Well, positivism, actually, who came up with it? It was an idea that that evolved from St. Simon and Auguste Comte. Comte, I think, is credited with being the guy really that kind of fleshed out the idea of positivism. And both of these guys were stuck on the idea of where does truth come from? How do we discover truth? And how can we know that truth is truth? It seems a little bit like staring at your belly button, doesn't it? In a way, it's like, well, I think, therefore I am. But they wanted to debate the issue of where truth comes from. And positivism, as it led ultimately into scientism as well, believed that truth could only be determined according to some other hard science type of either through rationalism or through science. Scientism really was kind of an extension of positivism in the sense that it excluded all other truth altogether other than science. Scientism says that only science can discover truth about man or reality, and that there is no other truth. Well, this immediately rejects the entire Judeo-Christian ethic. It completely rejects the Bible as truth. Supernatural truth has no place anywhere in either of these philosophies. And so if man cannot discover through his own rational efforts what truth is, there's no truth outside of that. If you were to suggest to your wife, well, honey, science says that there really is no basis for love. So, therefore, I guess, I guess I don't have to love you anymore. It's not going to fly. Scientism can't explain things like love and other human emotions, compassion, and caring and jealousy and stuff like that. It cannot explain it, cannot begin to explain it. So the fact is there really is truth outside of scientism, outside of positivism, but they just don't acknowledge it. They feel it's just, that's just irrational.
Well, I think they're just looking at a slice and they're saying it's irrational because every day people are learning things. There's truth continuously being revealed through the use of one's soul in observing, identifying, organizing, and communicating in this world. And then so the trickle-down precipitation of some of these ideas, sociology, scientism, positivism, end up over in Prussia, and there's this cat named Wilhelm Wundt, who I met through Chapter 8 in Antony Sutton's book on Skull and Bones and Education. And basically what you see is there's this Prussian scientist, pseudo-scientist, and he says that human beings have no soul, and therefore they work very much like clockwork oranges, and therefore they can be manipulated. And this is where outcome-based education comes from, which comes up to today's Common Core and its role in technocracy, because it's the technology being used to kind of give everyone the same kind of homogenized educational perspective that's very limited and based on artificial scarcity. I know that's a lot of words right there, but what do you think about it?
I think it's spot on. If you remove God completely from the equation of truth, basically that leaves man to be nothing more than just a bag of atoms that have been somehow randomly put together to create a human being for some period of time until you go dust unto dust. And if you're just a bag of atoms, then your bag of atoms is no better than anybody else's. It's just something that happens. It's something that should be managed. It's not something that should just be left to itself necessarily. And This is a very strange concept to most people when they really start thinking about it, but that's what it boils down to. They look at all of humanity, the scientists do that are involved in this scientism and technocracy idea, and transhumanism as well. They look at the whole human experiment, if you will. Well, it's not an experiment, but you understand what I'm saying. If all humans are just nothing more than a bag of atoms individually, then why not manage them? They're just like the koi in the koi pond out there. They're there to be managed, and somebody should stand up and manage them, for Pete's sake. They have no social qualms about doing that on that basis, and of course, a bag of atoms has no value. That, theoretically, that would make you worth something like $32.42 for the chemical composition of your body. Could we melt you down or whatever? But this is certainly not the value of man that we have historically, the value that was historically placed on man. And the Bible as an instrument of truth, as a declaration of truth over the decades and centuries and millennia, has given a very high value to man as a creation of God, not as a creation of just pure chance and just random whatever, according to Darwin's theory. But that man actually has a very high value, is created in the image of God, and so on and so on. This is totally rejected by Scientism, Positivism, and all the other isms as well. They're atheistic at best. They're humanistic, meaning the sum of all things is wrapped up in man.
Well, and if we all were bags of atoms, what would be the purpose or reason for life or death in the first place?
There'd be none.
And if you don't need purpose or reason or any of these things, I challenge you to just go spend a week in the wild, because you're going to need reason, you're going to need some common sense, you're going to need patience, all these things that make us human beings and make us different from the squirrels. Yeah.
The great genocides of the last century have all been predicated on this very thing, that life has no value. And that they're just a bunch of, they're just excess cattle in the feedlot that, need to be killed off because they're consuming too much or whatever. And, you look at some of the big genocides that have happened, whether it be during the Bolshevik Revolution or the Holodomor or the Cambodian genocide, killed some 3 million people. You say, how can a government kill the China, same thing. How can a government kill that many people and not have any conscience about it? Yeah, I would have conscience about it, but the people that actually did the killing had no conscience about that. 2 million, 3 million, 10 million, 30 million, whatever, of your own citizens, they're just viewed as just a bucket of atoms.
Pol Pot would get rid of you and you, because you both got glasses. So Pol Pot would have gotten rid of you, right?
Yeah.
So this trend in history, it didn't happen back in the time of St. Simon or Comte or even Robert Owen, but these ideas start to build up over decades, and it's not the messengers who delivered those ideas. Those ideas are out there and they're neutral. Different generations in different parts of the world, under different circumstances, pick them up and start to use them in tools, sometimes in not so friendly ways. I wanted to touch on Robert Owen in New Harmony, Indiana, and his do you know anything about the utopian colony there?
Say it again to me now.
Robert Owen,
yeah.
New Harmony, Indiana. He had set up, it was called, New Harmony was the place. Right. Utopian socialism.
Right. That commune experiment was, let's see, what was the time frame of that again? What year was that?
I thought it was in the 1860s, maybe. Maybe. I wish Kevin Cole was here.
Yeah. There was a number of communes set up in Canada to experience technocracy. Some of them are still around. They don't know why they're around because they've lost their technocracy flavor. Men have attempted utopian systems for a long time, certainly more than 100 years back. None have ever worked out very well because they have a structure that forces the people to conform within the utopian system. there's no reason to believe, based on any utopian experiment, that it would work on a larger scale with any greater success. But the utopians of today, somehow still beating their heads, against that same wall. But oh no, all we need to do to succeed is we just need to have a bigger system and more control. And somehow that's going to make the difference, and it's going to make it possible to have a good utopian system. But they've all failed. Every one of them has gone, back to whatever. I don't know. They just flopped. And the ones that are up in the technocracy experiments that were up in Canada, as far as we could determine, none of them remembered their technocratic roots. They're just existing. They don't know why they're there. But yeah.
Thorstein Veblen. I had become aware of him because of his writings on conspicuous consumption, and then later on I realized that he was a writer for the Journal on Race Relations. Race Development, the Journal of Race Development. That became Council on Foreign Relations Foreign Affairs magazine. So Foreign Affairs Today came from that. Some people thought it was a eugenics journal, but really it's about international relations. But if you get to international relations, that's kind of about eugenics as well. It's the control of other people outside of yourself. And that's kind of, I would say that's a sin, to control someone other than yourself, to have a slave like that. Thorstein Veblen, what does he mean to history, and how is his work applicable through today?
Well, Veblen was one of the instrumental technocrats that founded the technocracy movement in the 20s. Were it not for Veblen, I'm not sure how the whole thing would have turned out at all. But he was really the glue that was binding the people together in the 20s. And although I believe he died prematurely before the actual birth of technocracy in 1932, 3, and 4, he was really kind of the main guy that proposed bringing all these scientists and engineers together to talk about what he called a society or a Soviet of engineers. And it was not communism, it was not socialism.
What does Soviet mean?
Even though we called it Soviet. Soviet just means a method of control. In other words, using the engineering and science to control the society that is pointed towards. And so he brought together people like Howard Scott and like M. King Hubbard. That's where they, in fact, Howard Scott was the main disciple of Veblen. He was like the guy that was always there, to learn from him. And he took almost every idea that Veblen put out, and even went further in some ideas as he got started with his own independent Technocracy Incorporated movement. But if it were not for Veblen, I doubt Howard Scott would have ever got to where he got.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Same thing with M. King Hubbard.
Wow.
So he was instrumental.
Okay, so I think you're going to like this then. While Veblen's working for the Journal of Race Development, the Journal of Race Development was created in 1910 by G. Stanley Hall, who was a student of Wilhelm Wundt and also a member of Skull and Bones. I learned this all from a little tiny... See, Sutton published his Skull and Bones book in pamphlets. So when I first found this information, I'm looking for the pamphlet. I paid $80 for 20 pages. And then I found out it's in his other book. It's like chapter 8 in the bigger Skull and Bones Secret Establishment book. G. Stanley Hall is part of the Yale Troika of people who went overseas to be trained by Wundt to come back here and change our schooling system. And so now we have an overlap between Skull and Bones, technocracy, the Council on Foreign Relations, this idea of international relations. I think you're really onto something here. What can you say about G. Stanley Hall or the influence of Skull and Bones?
At the time, Skull and Bones was an influential organization in the sense that it brought together elite people to do, secretive / radical things in society. And back in from about 1900 up to 1935, maybe even 1940, I view that as a period of radicalism, a radical thought. Not radical in the sense just left wing, but radical in the sense that shake 'em up philosophies. Everybody wanted to have some new thing. They wanted to throw off the shackles of the old system, which is primarily based on religion and divine inspiration and so on. And they wanted to do something radically new. And I think a lot of that could be laid at the feet of Charles Darwin, for instance, who really stirred the pot with his Origin of Species and book, and got people to thinking. And then communism came along. Karl Marx proposed just some radical ideas that people were talking about, and the whole eugenics thing was floating around in those early days as well. There was a competition. I view it as a competition amongst thinkers to want to come up with the newest thing, the newest, most radical possible thing that they could think up. And I think a lot of them talked in that way, like, wow, so and so, Karl Marx got, he got all this stuff about, the basis for communism, but let's do something different. Let's think up some other cockeyed philosophy and see if we can make it stick when we throw it at the wall. So, you had technocrats thinking that way in the early days. Let's do something new. Let's not just take everything that's out there, but, let's invent some new thing. And, the eugenics movement was not a broad-based movement for sure, but it sure was testy. I'll say that, as far as being radical, having really far-out ideas and stuff. It was really off the wall, even back for those days. And so do you see the overlap between people involved with technocracy, like I said earlier, and eugenics? It doesn't mean that eugenics was organically hooked to technocracy when Howard Scott and Hubbard actually formed the organization in 1934. But the influence is obviously there.
There was a 19th century author named Edward Bellamy who wrote a book called Looking Backward. How did that affect the big box store culture we see today?
It was a huge book back in those days and continued well into the last century. And the book essentially was kind of a story of Rip Van Winkle type story, where a guy went to sleep or was in a coma or whatever for 100 years, and he woke up and he goes outside and goes, "Whoa, what's going on here?" And all of it, like a time traveler, and he awakes in this new utopian world, and he's looking backwards to see how things have changed since he was alive on planet Earth. And it was very much a picture of technocracy and utopian system that had evolved on Earth. And it wasn't exactly a science fiction book, but it had a wide appeal just because the way it was written. People just went nuts over it. And the book had a large influence on a number of people during the early 1900s because of that. It was visionary. It was really looking forward. That is, it was kind of progressive in its nature. And I'm sure that a lot of different groups that were talking different things, including the technocrats, had a stake in that book somewhere, in that whole idea that, hey, we're planning the future here. We're going to direct the future. We're going to be the future. And whoever gets to the future first is going to be the ones that wins the future, I guess. So, the communists, they wanted to get their future, and the technocrats wanted their future, and the fascists wanted their future, and everybody was vying for what was going to be the final, the state of the world. And this book I think had a profound effect on a number of people for different reasons. Not all the same, but I think a lot of people looked at it and said, "Wow, this is we need to think about the future." And then look at it kind of from a backwards point of view, how we're going to get there.
Well, and I think maybe one of the readers of that book was a young Herbert George Wells, as he was studying under T.H. Huxley, and he's like, wait a minute, this time travel thing is interesting, because he wrote The Time Machine, and then he wrote War in the Air, which was 1907, which predicts World War I, and then he wrote a whole bunch of other stuff, New World Order, the New Machiavellis. How does he fit in, or did his artistic stylings influence technocracy, do you think, or how do you think that
I don't think so. I don't think so necessarily. Engineers and scientists, especially the ones that exist at Columbia University, and by the way, I'm thinking probably half of those people that I remember by name were German. They have German extraction, and they very much had an idea of not invented here syndrome. They wanted to do. They wanted to be their particular invention, and that engineers are just kind of that way in general. I really don't mean to stereotype all engineers, but for the ones that have this mindset that they're superior to all other men, if an idea didn't come from them, it basically is no good. So that's why we see somebody like Al Gore hanging on to global warming, when maybe even the evidence is it might be going the other way. In fact, they used the same technique back in the 70s when they called for global cooling. We were all going to die because the world was going into ice age. And that didn't work out too well. So we didn't go into an ice age. So they turned it around and said, well, it's global warming. We got that wrong. It's not global warming. We're all going to die because the seas are going to rise. And it's kind of a crazy.
It's a sales pitch. Al Gore's pitching you on a story so he can buy beachfront property at low price.
Yeah,
I've seen that happen before.
Yeah.
Fabian socialism and technocracy. Is there any connection? Is there any cross-influence? Are there cross-memberships?
The difference between Fabian socialism and technocracy, again, harkens back to how the economic system works. Technocracy was not proposed as a political management or a political system or a political form of government. Whereas Fabian socialism basically merged the corporate world with the governmental system, whatever that might be. Whether it was Nazi Germany or whether it was Mussolini. Even the president of Columbia University had ideas on Fabian socialism and probably would have liked to have seen it in the United States. But it's still based on a price, it presumes a price-based economic system, nevertheless. Supply and demand, using a currency to exchange goods and services. You still had various limits of private and personal property involved in all those systems. Technocracy proposed to do away with the price-based system altogether. So on one hand, even though you can see some kind of structural similarities between the totalitarian system of technocracy versus the totalitarian system of fascism, they're different. And where they're different is how they, at the very bottom of the economic system, one has supply and demand capitalistic economics, and the other has no supply and demand, an energy-based or resource-based economic system, and they're otherworldly to each other. You can't describe them in the same sentence because they don't fit in the same sentence. They're otherworldly concepts. I'll say, by the way, people are wondering today why the world economically is upside down. There's things happening in the world today that fit no economic model that I ever studied 45, 50 years ago in college. They just don't work anymore. Economists are scratching their head trying to write new laws and new things to explain what's going on in the world. It doesn't fit. Nobody, to my knowledge, in the economic world has considered that there are two economic systems fighting for control over the whole world right now. One is capitalism and one is technocracy. One's going to die and one's going to live. The question is, which one? Will capitalism survive, or will it be truly supplanted with technocracy? Because the two economic systems are they're not even oil and water. They're worse than that. They cannot exist. It's almost like matter and antimatter. They cannot exist in the same space. One will die and one will live.
Are you familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations War and Peace Studies project from 1939?
Not immediately familiar, but I have been in the past.
I'm going to go to the next question then. Rockefellers, the Rockefeller family and their role in the League of Nations and the United Nations, and Columbia University, if you want.
Well, the Rockefellers had a deep association with all three. There were major benefactors to Columbia, major benefactors to starting the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations. I mean, they've been involved in just about everything in the last century that's plaguing us today, that's bothering us today. It wasn't surprising. Well, I'll tell you what was surprising. In that technocracy was housed in Columbia University for a time, it is surprising that there was no institutional money coming from like the Rockefeller family or some of the other big families of the day, because that was right up their alley. Columbia was right up their alley. In fact, the competitor to Columbia University in the local scene in New York was called the New School, which is even more radical than Columbia. And between the two of them, they kind of had a lock on radicalism and institutional money. But they never got any money. Technocracy never got any money from these people at all. They just were passed over until the 70s, of course.
Who created the New School for Social Research?
You'll have to refresh my memory. I
thought it was Thorsten Veblen.
I do. I want to say Thorsten Veblen was the founder of the New School.
Sure.
And he was the father, of course, of technocracy. Well, one of the fathers of technocracy.
And there's a strong Fabian socialist influence through the New School.
Absolutely.
And I believe the New School for Social Research, which is based in New York City, it produced one of the 9/11 committee commissioners. I believe it was Bob Kerrey went to the New School.
The New School has been a hotbed of radicalism ever since it was founded.
What do you think its purpose is in this country?
Well, it was certainly to spread the ideas that the radical ideas that they had cooked up along the way. They did a very good job of it. They were the first university in America to establish a teachers' college, where they trained, I don't know how many tens of thousands of teachers around the country, and they sent them out to, they end up in universities and high schools, I mean, everywhere, where they learned the techniques of teaching progressivism at the New School. And in fact, the New School that wasn't their original name. It was a New School for Social Research or something like that. It was a different name, and originally they dropped it later. But they had a profound influence on the educational community in America, and I think probably we see a lot of it still today. That influence just kind of overwhelmed the world of academia with radical ideas and stuff and radical teachers.
Sure. And John D. Rockefeller gave $1 million to the Columbia Teachers College, and there was a lot of money flowing into those ideas of control. There was a Columbia School of Journalism. Rockefeller Center was originally leased from Columbia University before they purchased it. What do you know about the Rockefellers' role in the creation of the United Nations?
Well, they gave the land upon which the UN sits. They donated tons of money and resources over the years to it. The United Nations, a few years ago anyway, gave a huge accolade to the Rockefellers for the instrumental work they did to make the UN a reality. So their fingerprints all over it. That's about all you can say. They've had a profound influence on it, and I fully expect that the payback for the Rockefeller influence at the United Nations was achieved when the Trilateral Commission turned to the United Nations to use them as a contagion factor for Agenda 21, for sustainable development, for, et cetera, et cetera. And they have been the contagion that spread this to every corner of the planet today. So, was it a good move on their part to start this in the first place? I think they probably knew it was going to be a good thing in the end. They just kept throwing money at it, kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, I think part of the gambit was the creation of the League of Nations as a structure that was idealistic but was set up to fail, just so they could create the United Nations in a bigger, better, more proliferated form. I read your book Sunday, and on Saturday I had just finished doing the introductory montage for my podcast, and I was looking for evidence in video and audio form that the Rockefellers helped create the United Nations. I found this tremendous piece with Boutros Boutros-Ghali giving this, and it's just like the official United Nations thank you to the Rockefeller family. And then the next day when I was reading through your book, you found a parallel path that proves the exact same thing from different evidence, and I was like, this is awesome. I finally, because people, they're like, the United Nations is philanthropic, they're there to help people, and it's really a United Nations. I'm like, no. The people that were running the world were seeking a better graphical user interface, a better front end, because what they're doing is really ugly. They have to use public relations and words and images and propaganda to make it look pretty. And then we have to do this to tell people what's going on.
Yeah, that's right.
What is meant by the United Nations use of the term interdependence?
This was a word or a phrase that was, as far as I know, was originally coined, or at least let's say popularized, by the Trilateral Commission in 1973. They used the word interdependence all over their literature. That was the flip side to their new international economic order pitch. Because of that, in order to implement that, we had to honor the interdependence that was developing amongst nations. I don't think there was any public demand for that back in those days.
So under capitalism, that idea would not have flown, but in the controlled market, it flies.
They kept repeating interdependence over and over again until people believed it as being true. And so academics started writing about it. People like Richard Gardner, early member of the Trilateral Commission, started writing about it, and others. And all of a sudden, the mantra was interdependence, interdependence. Oh my gosh, we need to rush, hurry up and, control this whole process of going on interdependence. And there never really was any public demand for interdependence whatsoever. They just created it out of thin air. The United Nations picked it up, of course, and ran with it. And that has been one of the main instruments of interdependence, creating the system of interdependence, is through the United Nations. Even if most Americans would have thought, let's get the U.S. or get the United Nations out of the U.S. I remember those bumper stickers that were appeared a lot in the 70s and 80s. Most Americans didn't feel like the UN influenced America very much. But that wasn't true in other countries around the world. It was based here as viewed as more or less as a policy organ of the U.S., but it had a huge impact around the world on other countries and building the so-called system of interdependence. And I expect that they'll have their legacy in why countries in South America, for instance, hate the United States with passion, because we meddled with them to the point where we either bankrupted them or whatever, did horrible things to them. And they generally hate America for it. That really shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be they hate Americans, because you and I didn't do it. And I don't know any American, really true American, that did it either, but it was just a relatively small group of people.
I could blame Nelson Rockefeller as, leading through Latin America, the South American policies. Yeah. Henry Kissinger.
That's right. Yep.
What do you know about the others? So the Trilateral Commission was, of course, created by Brzezinski and David Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, his older brother, who had been vice president in the 70s, his protege was Kissinger. So Brzezinski and Kissinger are like the bookends to be able to, the vice grips to be able to squeeze in on America. How familiar are you with Nelson Rockefeller's history and the things, even though he's not officially in the Trilateral Commission, obviously they're brothers and they're running an agenda.
That's right.
So how do you see it fitting together?
They were very close, actually. Nelson always aspired to be a politician. I don't feel sorry for him that he had to be appointed to be vice president. But, the poor guy, he wanted to be a politician and he couldn't get elected anywhere. I don't know that David Rockefeller would have ever got elected anywhere either. Jay Rockefeller got elected in West Virginia. But Nelson was appointed to be vice president after Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. And so you had a Beauty and the Beast kind of pairing with an unelected president and an unelected vice president at the same time. more importantly is a question of why Nelson Rockefeller? Why would they want to get him in at that time? This was just after the Trilateral Commission had been founded in 1973. In my view and study of this, the most important thing that Nelson Rockefeller did is that he presided as president of the Senate, as vice president. And the Senate in 1974 passed the first iteration of the Trade Promotion Authority Act, the Trade Act of 1974, that set up this so-called fast-track legislation method for trade treaties that would be negotiated by the executive branch, in particular the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, as is known. And that legislation got railroaded through by Nelson Rockefeller, and it was passed in the Senate, the first iteration of it, and it was given a life of its own. The Senate even still realized how dangerous fast track was, and they gave it a sunset clause so that it would automatically expire after a period of years. It has since been reauthorized multiple times. Right now, it is not authorized. Currently, the president is trying to get fast track reauthorized by the Senate and put into place so we can present the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership as well, which is coming shortly. But Bill Clinton, through a great battle, was able to get fast-track authorization together for NAFTA and CAFTA later. And most of the nefarious treaties that have really done damage to our country have been passed under fast-track legislation. The key thing about fast-track is that it takes away, Congress, or the Senate in particular, delegated to the executive branch the ability to negotiate these treaties. Constitutionally speaking, it's the Senate's job to do that completely. They should be the ones negotiating treaties, and a treaty should only be passed with a 2/3 vote, 66% plus one. And what happens with fast track is that it gives the president the ability to present a treaty agreement for approval. It can have no amendments attached to it. In other words, they can't do a thing to it. They have to take it the way it is or reject it the way it is. There was only 20 hours of floor debate to be allowed, which is nothing when you get the whole Senate together. 20 hours is just minuscule. And most importantly, it reduced the vote from a 2/3 vote down to 50%. So that's a shoe-in almost. So when NAFTA was presented, for instance, and it passed, before it passed the Senate vote, the Trilateral Commission pulled out all the big guns to hammerhead in the Senate on people to get them to vote for the treaty for NAFTA. And they had a hard time even getting 50%, 51%. They did, but they hauled out the Henry Kissingers of the world to go in and pound on them and tell them why they need this and, yada, yada. But NAFTA, just as a side note, was architected by Carla Hills, who was the USTR at the time. She was also a member of the Trilateral Commission. And for all intents and purposes, the North American Free Trade Agreement was a creation of trilateral policy, written by and architected by a member of the Trilateral Commission, signed first by George Bush, a member of the Trilateral Commission, pushed into law by Bill Clinton, a member of the Trilateral Commission, and lobbied by numerous members of the Trilateral Commission, including Jimmy Carter, George Bush, Henry Kissinger, and so on. It worked hand in glove with the work of Nelson Rockefeller from 1974. This was a key piece of legislation that they had to have in place, or they would never, ever have been able to pull off the economic coup that they pulled off in the last 40 years. Nelson did it.
So they brought him in. They brought him in as a specialized tool, and he did a certain job that opens up the doors for internationalism in the future.
That's right.
Public-private partnerships, CAFTA, NAFTA. These are all internationalist ideas. And it was his brother, I think, on page 505 that says, you guys accuse my family of being internationalist. He's like, we are. Mm-hmm. And he's like, get over it. This is the future. So these, again, it goes back to people who prophesy a future. It's a utopia that's run benevolently by them. And you see these names come up over and over again through 20th century history. Like when I learned about the Rockefeller family and their involvement in the education system and the creation of the General Education Board, I was like, that's bad. And then when they're involved with creating the United Nations, that's worse. But then it's like Rockefeller Medicine Men. Have you ever heard of that book by E. Richard Brown?
Yeah.
Rockefeller and the Aspen Institute. Now, Rockefeller was instrumental in creating University of Chicago and giving it a whole bunch of money. That's where Robert Maynard Hutchins was, working on the great books of the Western world, which has a whole lot of other British Empire influence coming into that. And then they kind of formulated over here at the Aspen Institute. So what role did you see as far as bringing maybe the Humanist Manifesto forward? How did you see the Aspen Institute playing a role in what you've studied?
It was originally called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. They changed the name later. I expect they might have gotten some heat for being a religion, which it was, but it was the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. Now it's just the Aspen Institute. There were various members of the Trilateral Commission that were very heavily involved in the Aspen Institute. They didn't create it, but they were heavily involved in it. And that is at the board of directors level. And the board of directors obviously directs the overall thrust of the organization. And the seminars that and conferences that they set up at their headquarters, that's in Colorado, and later at other facilities that they planted around the world, they would involve executives from the top executives, board members, CEOs, vice presidents, and so on of large companies to come and learn a common philosophy, if you will, of business management. Now, not surprisingly, this rested mostly on things like systems theory and the scientific method of running a business. And they spread this philosophy all over the world, all Fortune 5,000 companies. Then they later began to teach middle management the same principles and so on, who later became senior management. And the corporate world has been seeded with this philosophy and this methodology of management ever since. They were horribly influential, I have to say. It's like you can't really appreciate how influential until you see how many people migrated through their programs. And they didn't migrate through as a mandatory thing, like, it wasn't like, well, if you don't go to this, you're fired sort of thing. No, they went to it to network, they went to it to find out the latest ideas on management of a company and so on. And humanistic studies is very much a religious proposition. So, to say that all these corporate engineers and so on are corporate mucky mucks are humanists probably would be an understatement. To call them religious, they would argue that. Well, no, I'm not religious at all. But the Supreme Court even declared that humanism was a religion. So I won't argue with it. It has all the earmarks of it.
Are you familiar with the Reese Committee, where they studied the effect of nonprofit foundations and their influence on America?
Right. Yeah, it's huge. The influence was just huge. If it were not for these large bodies of independent slush fund money, we wouldn't be where we are today. That's just flat out true. Whether it's today in the more modern context, whether it's a Bill Gates or some of the other big billionaires of the world, or whether it's old money like from the Rockefeller family or some of the banking institutions of the world. When they got the ability to set up the NGOs and these independent think tanks and trust funds and so on, and started pumping money into it, it has really been the engine of social change for the last 100 years, very much so. They've had their fingerprints on everything.
It's like if they had 10 fingers and 10 toes in the in the pie. That's not enough. You can't even describe their activities with that. So you've got these foundations. You've got their influence in the university system. You got their influence in grade school and how school comes about. You got their influence over how businesses are being run. They help to create the United Nations, and then they go and create Bretton Woods, the IMF, and World Bank. And this is also running parallel to this idea of technocracy, which they haven't brought back to the surface yet. It's like a submarine. I think I read that someplace. It's like a submarine, and it wasn't visible at that point, but those things were being developed, and then Brzezinski kind of rose and brought it together. How would you describe it in your words?
Well, I think that's the way it is. in Nazi Germany especially, when Hitler nixed the Technocracy organization, they just went, dive, and they went under the water, and they were still there the whole time.
I think there was more than one submarine. Eugenics went under and came up molecular biology. It was like, they just take this little side route, and then we lose their trail. I think at one point it's Agenda 21. No one hears of Agenda 21 because you gave about 10 synonyms for it. How else is Agenda 21 known today as far as what are its synonyms?
Yeah, you've got a number of things that spring from it, and I suppose my identification of technocracy has a lot to do with that, because you have to look at the bigger picture and how we got here to understand what really is a part and what isn't a part. But the original technocracy documents from the 30s had provisions for what they call functional sequences in governance, not government, governance, the management of society. A functional sequence was some common area in society that needs to be managed by a central authority. Healthcare would be a good example of a functional sequence. Manufacturing would be a functional sequence. Education, they called a service sequence because it wasn't making anything, it was a service provided. But they specified all this stuff originally in the technocracy study course. And education, for instance, is a fundamental part of technocracy. They called it a system of continental conditioning. That was their view of education. Well, I thought education was about learning things and learning how to think critically and reason things out. I said, no, that may be true for you and I, but it wasn't for them. For them, it was just a matter of conditioning. And I'm sure when they wrote that, they were they had Pavlov in mind with his conditioning the animals to drool when they ring a bell. That's really all education to them really was important for. And that's what we see in Common Core today. It's the same kind of thing. It's a system of human conditioning. It's not a system of education. You have smart grid, the idea of putting these meters and stuff on people's and businesses to control the energy that is consumed within those facilities. This is an original specification of technocracy from the 1930s. You have the massive surveillance that's going on today with a total awareness society. This was an original specification from technocracy in the 1930s. You cannot manage what you cannot monitor. That's an engineer's mindset. If people need to think like engineers. You can't manage what you cannot monitor. Can't control it. So you have to manage it. Well, what do you need to monitor? Well, I need data. That's what they'll say. Oh, we have to have data. Well, what kind of data do you need? Well, I need everything. How much data is enough? No, there's no such thing. There's never enough data. You always need more data. So what do you need? What kind of data do you need? Well, we need, if it's an economic system we're managing, we need to have all the financial records. We need to know what's in people's minds psychologically, what they want to buy, what they want to do with their lives. We need to have all their health records because, that's important to manage the health of the society. They need all the education records, like Common Core collects 400 data points on students now, becomes a permanent part of their record forever. It'll follow them until they die. And you have public-private partnerships, which has flavors of fascism in it, but it's not quite, but it's flavors of it. All of these things come from the same source. They were all specified and talked about in the Agenda 21 document that was produced by the Rio Conference. What people just don't get, and they're shocked to find out, is that the United Nations itself says that the Rio Conference was preceded by the Brundtland Commission, which is widely credited by the UN itself as being the foundation stone for the Rio Conference to take place. They point back to the Brundtland Commission. The Brundtland Commission convened in 1982 and it ended in 1987 with the production of a book called Our Common Future. That was the book that staked the claim of sustainable development. They popularized the term. It had been mentioned before, but they were the ones that really brought it to society's lips. And Our Common Future became the book that fueled virtually 100% of the policies that made their way into the Agenda 21 book. What the real conference did was merely to bring together whatever it was, 190 nations from around the world to talk about it and to ratify it. It was kind of a giant consensus meeting, if you will. This is what we've got on the table. What do you think? And so, they got agreement. A lot of people signed it. President Bush signed some of it himself. Bill Clinton said, I would have signed it all proudly. Fortunately, he wasn't president at the time. He didn't. But what people don't understand is the perverseness of Agenda 21, because Gro Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, ex-Prime Minister of Norway, was a member of the Trilateral Commission from Europe. The question immediately surfaces, is Agenda 21 an off-the-wall United Nations creation, or was it architected, as was NAFTA by Carla Hills, was it architected for other purposes or for us, for the real people of the world? And the answer is obviously not. They architected this for themselves, and the only purpose the Trilateral Commission had in 1982 was to create a new international economic order. That was their stated purpose even then. And so did she play into that, or did she fight against that when she wrote Our Common Future? Duh, of course. She's following the party line, and she's promoting the new international economic order. The United Nations picks it up. The real conference happens. Agenda 21 book is published. The book on biodiversity follows right on its heels. That's the practical implementation of Agenda 21 policies around the world. There was a couple other books that went along with it as well. And so now we have today Sustainable Development / Earth Charter / all this green economy stuff in every corner of the world today. It's everywhere. They've taken it to every nation, to every village, to every district, every county, whatever, and we find it everywhere. But we find its genesis smack dab in the middle of the Trilateral Commission again. This is their creation. It's their baby.
Well, it's also the place where it overlaps with the participation of what I would call the Rothschild Empire, because it's a banking empire, and it was Baron Edmund de Rothschild in 1987 at the UN UNCED conference, where he and Morris Strong.
Morris Strong.
Yeah. It's spelled Maurice, but he says it's Morris. Interesting. Those guys are.
We'll call him Maurice.
Yeah, I'll just call him Maurice. I'll just ignore it. Just like Morris Greenberg. So you got these characters that they're participating in this United Nations project. But clearly, if you understand the context of where Edmund de Rothschild's coming from, and where his interests lie, you see that this is a group of people who seek to have control, and it's kind of greed, run amok, and they're able to make up the rules using such words that it gives them pseudo-authority over the world, as long as people believe that. And that's what I think we're trying to get to. It's like these people have created an artificial construct, created these illusions so that we would say, oh yes, Agenda 21, that's the United Nations. We got to listen to that. They also say to disarm the country, and how would the Rockefellers benefit from individuals not being able to defend themselves? What happens then? I mean, what would you get down to? It's always been a struggle for freedom and prosperity versus tyranny and slavery, and people trying to plunder that production. So, moving forward through that lens, that obviously the bankers have always found it profitable to put people at odds and to fund both sides. The rise of not only Edmund de Rothschild, the elder French banker, but David de Rothschild, who wrote the Agenda 21 kind of handbook to comic book it down for young people. That's the agenda being carried across many generations. I mean, so how would you describe that phenomenon? I mean, is that a hobby to these types of families to say, they just have these projects and we're watching sitcoms? Is that the difference in lifestyle?
I think even the bankers, maybe especially the bankers whose expertise is money. That's That's their claim to fame. They don't make anything otherwise, but they know money. I'm sure they know money pretty well. And I have a feeling that the banking community globally understands that it was never, the way they were architecting it was never meant to be permanent. And that somewhere along the way there is an end to money as they know it. This is kind of hard to get your head around in a way, because you want to say, well, why would somebody like Rockefeller be fighting to destroy capitalism? I mean, isn't that going to destroy him too? Yeah, first of it, you think, well, it certainly would hurt him if he's figuring everything in terms of just money. And I'm sure the central bankers, that people are operating as central banks, families like the banking families, like the Rockefellers, like the Rothschilds, and so on. I expect they have a different view of wealth than you and I would. From my perspective, if I had $100,000 in the bank, well, it'd be great. I say, well, I've got some padding, I've got some savings, whatever, and if I get in trouble, I can pull myself through. If I had a few million in the bank, it'd be even better. But money is not a store of, people call it a store of value, but there is no value in money, you realize. Money can be declared obsolete tomorrow in a heartbeat. Your $1 million is just smoke. It can be burned up in an incinerator in about 5 minutes, and where's your money then? The real value of wealth historically has been in resources of the earth. Everything comes from the earth. All the gold, all the oil, all the the agricultural products, everything that we make has stuff that's taken out of the earth. The lumber that we use to build homes and fuel, fires and stuff and so on around the world. Wood is still the most important fuel for burning, for people to stay warm. And value and wealth is really rooted in the planet, in the earth. And my guess is these people understand this principle pretty well. So it's not just about making money as we used to think, as Sutton and I thought back in the 70s and 80s. It's not just about making money, although they're making money and they're accumulating things along the way. They're certainly a big notch above where we stand. But in the end of it, if wealth is determined on control over resources, then the end game must be to control resources. Not necessarily just have the money, just take away the money and say who actually has their hand on the resources of the world. All around the world today, the United Nations and governments are gobbling up land at a breakneck speed. That's true in the United States. It's true with United Nations heritage designations that are being applied to tracts of land all over the world. The Bureau of Land Management is still gobbling up land like there's no tomorrow. The Nature Conservancy is gobbling up land and selling it to the BLM for a profit. You've got the Park Service, setting land aside essentially under government control, closing off the gates so nobody can get into it, whatever. And people think, well, that's just for the save the environment. That's nonsense. It's to save the resources to take the resources offline, to make the resources scarce, so that when the oligarchy, if you will, sets up that global trust one day, the resources of the world are going to be placed in that global trust for the common good. You're kind of back to hold-ons again in a way. You can't be trusted with private property because you would do selfish things. Well, you might cut down all the trees on your property or whatever. You might dig a water well that consumes too much water out of planet Earth, whatever. You can't be trusted with resources, but somehow they can. So in the end of it, if you can picture the technocracy world of the future, energy will be controlled so that people must do what they have energy available to do. The resources of the world where everything is drawn out of will be licensed to people like you and I through a permit process where we might be able to scratch out a living on a corner of land somewhere as a farmer. We might be a miner, we might be an oil driller, whatever, and we may or may not get licenses to do anything. This is essentially like the feudal system in the Dark Ages where the land barons owned everything and you had to squat on a piece of ground. If the guy liked you, he'd let you stay and farm out, maybe raise some hogs or something, and you give him 80% of what you made and you get the balance to keep your family alive if you could. This control over resources is clearly where everything is moving today. This is what sustainable development is all about. Twisting the resources out of the hands of the people and putting it into the hands of the elite. That's the scam in the simplest terms that I can describe. Getting the resources away from you and me and putting it into the hands of a global trust organization. They never say who the trustees are going to be. History tells us exactly who it's going to be. It's going to be the people that set up the system. In other words, whoever implements technocracy is going to be the ones worthy to be the trustees of all the resources of the world. They haven't helped the world.
You were discussing the feudalistic concept and how it existed in Europe. What put an end to it? I mean, why don't we live into? I'm sorry about that. Why don't we live into that environment today? What's the difference between America and Europe?
Well, Europe was not always under the oppression of the European Union like they have today. Europe has always been a group of nations that didn't get along very well together, but they were typically still very nationalistic and proud of their nationality. The system of the general theory of liberty took at least 300 years to develop since the feudal society. It was a slow process. There were a number of people that came along during that time to write treatises of one kind or another about the value of liberty, the value of freedom, the value of self-determination, and so on. All of those documents historically, many of which came from Great Britain, by the way, those documents ended up in the culmination of our founding documents of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. All of that thinking went into it. We have one of the reasons that we have the expression of liberty and freedom that we've had in our country is specifically because of those 300 or 400 years of influence to get to where we could even write the Constitution. It's a very slow, drawn-out process. I've said in context of technocracy, if technocracy wins this battle and they implement it on a global basis, it will again take hundreds of years before, at least hundreds of years before the concept of freedom and liberty will surface again. It will take a very long time, maybe much longer than before. But it won't just come snapping back, and it's not going to be like, well, it's a fad, and they'll do it for 4 or 5 years, and then we'll go back to doing what we want to do. No, once they get control of the economic mechanism, they will have control virtually over life itself, and they'll be able to make the peoples of the world dance like puppets on a string.
It reminded me of that H.G. Wells book, The Shape of Things to Come, that was made into Things to Come, the movie. And the movie is more powerful, in my opinion, than the book because a lot of those things ended up being developed. And I don't want to harp on H.G. Wells. I want to move back into Brzezinski. Now that you've described freedom and how it evolved very slowly and painfully out of feudalism, what does Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, America in the Technotronic Era, what is the Technotronic Era, and what is he trying to take us back to or take us out of?
Well, he's trying to take us forward through the stepping stones of Marxism to arrive at this Technotronic Era. And I'll say up front, openly, that Brzezinski has been charged with being a Marxist or a communist many times over the years. But if you read his book, you will find out he never was a Marxist. He didn't say that Marxism was a good thing per se, but what he did say is merely a stepping stone, a necessary stepping stone to get to the fourth and final stage of what he calls societal evolution. Remember, he's a political scientist. He talks in weird terms, but he talks about societal evolution. It's gone through these stages, these maturing process. Marxism was simply just one of those stepping stones, and we had to have it. But we have to get through it. And when we get through it, what we'll end up is with what he described as his Technotronic Era, and essentially that would be something very comparable to technocracy that we're talking about, where everything is managed by an elite, where technology is used to do the managing, In that sense, by the way, it's important to differentiate between a personal dictator, like you had, well, even like you had Adolf Hitler, or you had Nero, and the old in Rome. There were dictators where if he said off with your head, well, your head was gone. That was just that simple. What the technocratic era does is it creates a system of control, not controlled necessarily by an individual, but the system is the controller of society. And this is what we see, this is what technocracy is all about, applying systems theory to sociological engineering, so that rules and regulations are put in place to be enforced by technology that will keep you in a channel that they want to keep you in. I use the example of go to your bank and try and get more than $300 out of the ATM machine. They just flat out won't do it. It'll tell you your daily limit is $300. And you say, but I've got $100,000 in the bank. I want my money. Oh, sorry, can't get out of this ATM. You could go down the street to another branch of your bank and you put your card in. It knows you drew out the other one. It's going to say, oh, you already taken out your daily limit. Sorry, bub. And if you go inside the bank and ask for the teller just to give you some money, first she'll ask you what you want the money for. You say, it's none of your business. I want my money. If you get past that argument, she'll say, well, we really only have $3,000 in cash in our bank at any one time anymore. And that's true. The banks are not carrying cash anymore for large withdrawals. And so she will say something like, well, we can get the money here, but we'll have to call an armored truck and get it ordered in from another regional bank, and it may take anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks to get that kind of money here. You say, well, I would really count on getting my money today. I thought I could just draw it out. You can't. See, regulations have been put in place that block you from doing stuff like that. And this is what's going to happen in the future in an increasing manner. Another good example I like to use in terms of carbon footprint is that once smart meters are in place and monitoring the power consumption of everybody's home, imagine your carbon footprint in your home being matched to things like, for instance, the no-fly list. Right now, it just consists of terrorists and stuff. People who they say are many people. I remember one time there was a 5-year-old child that was on a no-fly list. You say, how the heck did that happen? The kid never was nothing.
He must not have paid his taxes.
Must have done something wrong, yeah. But if you can imagine that you're kind of independent on your power usage, and so you use maybe 20% more than your neighbors just because you got the money, you can buy the power, whatever. But you go to buy a plane ticket to maybe to go visit somebody in Los Angeles, maybe somebody died in your family or whatever. I'm going to go to the funeral. And so you go online and make your plane reservation, and you put in your information or whatever, and it goes processing, and all of a sudden a screen pops up and says you're disallowed to buy the plane ticket. And you say, why? And it says you have exceeded your carbon footprint by 20%. You see, and if you fly on that airplane, why, you're really going to go over. So we're going to put you back in line. Now, after the first of the next month, if you're good for the rest of this month, if you're on point, then next month you're welcome to buy a plane ticket to go to Los Angeles. See, that kind of thing is very plausible in the future, the way this thing is going. Al Gore even said just a few weeks ago, talking about climate change, as he always does, he called everybody that doesn't believe like him a denier. And he says deniers deserve to be punished. That's what he said. He used the word punished. That's a dangerous thought for any American to say, that if you don't believe like somebody else, you deserve to be punished just because you don't believe that way. But see, this mentality is hooked into the mindset of technocrats. This is the way they think. If you don't believe the way they believe and do what they say, you deserve to be punished. So let me count the ways how I can punish you.
Well, and it's no different than Brave New World. The managerial class is exempt from the rules. They can have art and they can have access to this occulted information. And in 1984, obviously O'Brien has access to whatever he wants.
Right.
And it's a form of caste system. It's a knowledge, power, wealth gap. It's the same. It's a new flavor on how they've been ruling people for thousands of years.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And now the system will do the ruling. The system will do the managing. And of course, that was a major theme in Brave New World. The system did everything. And if you didn't like the way the system was, well, hey, it's the system, man.
It's the state.
You can't change the system.
And Huxley made it clear there was no parents. The first scene in the movie, first chapter in the book, is the breeding room where they're putting them together through the machines and stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, what happens when you have no parents? Oh, everyone's just brought up by the state. I mean, these are ideas that I'm sure were on the cusp of other tyrants, minds back in the day, but they never got them written down. You've got families like the Medicis, who were great banking influential family. They had Machiavelli. So the Rockefellers, they had already collected Henry Kissinger. They said, hey, Brzezinski, I like that idea you got there. Something to that. And at the 1972 Bilderberg meeting, David Rockefeller and Brzezinski are there. And what happened?
Well, they simply went over there to bounce the idea of founding the Trilateral Commission off their buddies. And they got a lot of encouragement. I couldn't tell you specifically who encouraged them, but that's what Rockefeller later said.
Yeah.
That they got a lot of favorable comments and stuff, enough so they came back and actually founded the Trilateral Commission. And I'm sure that some of the people in that Bilderberg meeting were actually invited to join the Trilateral Commission. That mostly would have been the European component, probably, because the Bilderbergs met in Europe. There were some Americans there as well. Probably people like Henry Kissinger there, for instance. He was an early member of the Trilateral Commission. So there would have been some Americans as well. My guess is Rockefeller already talked to some of them about, hey, if I start this, would you join? Become one of the charter members, if you will. I'll point out, however, that they never did have an application process. You don't apply to become a member of this group. It's run like a fraternity, where you have pledge week, so to speak, and everybody goes to the parties, and you hope, if you want to get into a particular fraternity, you hope somebody from that fraternity comes up and taps you on the shoulder and says, come with me. And then they put you through rush week to actually join, or candidating process to join the fraternity. That's the way it is. They have an executive committee that meets and discusses who they want to invite to be members. And you obviously are identified as a 100% game player, on their side before you're invited to join. Otherwise, I'm sure they can invite you to go disjoin. It's not get out. If you turn against them, you're probably not going to last. But this process has been used since day one, and the Trilateral Commission itself has written about that, and that's their standard procedure for inducting new members.
How did Jimmy Carter come to be president? Through the Trilateral Commission?
Later, after the Carter presidency, Brzezinski himself wrote that it was he who picked Jimmy Carter as a candidate early on. There was some risk in it, I suppose, that somebody else could have gotten the presidency, but he did. And Brzezinski became the first NSA, the National Security Advisor. But Brzezinski bragged about educating Carter and everything that he needed to know about foreign policy and about the economic policy of the world, which was administered through the State Department primarily. And Carter and Mondale both were members of the Trilateral Commission by the time they ran for office. Carter came into office as being the poor boy peanut farmer from Georgia. Aw shucks, ma. Not knowing anybody in Washington, he said, I'm so disconnected, I don't know what I'll do. And most importantly, he said, I'll never lie to you. He said, that was a big campaign promise. I'll never lie to you. I don't think he ever told the truth. In fact, that's all he could do is lie, kind of like somebody else I know in a modern context, but won't mention any names. But Carter immediately proceeded to appoint members of the Trilateral Commission to his cabinet, to top State Department posts. And at one point, he had almost 1/3 of the entire U.S. membership involved in his administration.
That's a lot of people.
Talk about undue influence.
Yeah.
Well, considering there's only I think about 90 people from the United States in the commission at that time, 1/3 is a lot. And at one point, all but one member of his cabinet was not a member of the Trilateral Commission. All the rest of them were. So immediately, the Trilateral Commission had undue influence in the executive branch, and it wouldn't have mattered what organization they came from, I suppose. If they had come from the YMCA, I would have been concerned. It's like, wait a minute, that's statistically impossible. If you're picking people just kind of from society in general, you can't come up with that many people from the same narrow organization. I don't care who they are. And the fact that they had an established agenda was even of greater concern. And here you have an international group meeting in plenary sessions to hammer out policies. And they vote on the policies that they're going to take back to the respective countries. And then this group from America comes back and implements these policies in our country without any public involvement whatsoever, without the involvement of Congress, and they just do it. It's like, what gives them the right to do this? See, this was a hijacking, literally, of the American government, of the executive branch. But it was not a political coup, even though it involves a political system. You say, why did they want control of the executive branch of the American government? Well, the executive branch was the mover, shaker, and driver of the global economy. Period. We were the superpower. And there was no country that had the influence that we had on global economics and global policy other than the United States. They wanted to get control of that engine of economic process so that they could create their new international economic order. That was their stated purpose. The United States government machinery allowed them to do that. And the evidence now, looking backwards, is so overwhelming on how they did it. For instance, the first USTR was appointed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. There have been 12 USTRs since then. 9 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission, appointed by the president at the time. 9 out of 12 have been members, including the current one, Michael Froman, who's negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a member of the Trilateral Commission. Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama appointed Froman. And, you have like the World Bank. There's been 8 bank presidents that appointed by our president of the World Bank. The World Bank is undeniably the engine of global economic transformation. These people have been nefarious, horrible some of the stuff they've done over the decades. But out of 8 World Bank presidents appointed by our president, 6 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. Well, how does this come about? You see, it wasn't about political control, it's about economic control. They were going to transform America in the process, but it wasn't about America. It was about the rest of the world. And so you see their influence in things like the USTR, the World Bank, through the intelligence establishment and so on, like the National Security Advisor and so on. The NSA, by the way, is a position in government. He's the gatekeeper to the president. Personally, I think it's the second most powerful position in the government, because he's able to limit information as well as give information to the president. So if you have somebody that has an agenda to hide, deceive, or whatever, the NSA is the one that has the ability to do it. And so, we see over a period of time, the NSAs, I think there's been 17 of them since Carter. Out of 17, 10 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. That's statistically impossible if you just figure they're going to pick it out of 300 million people in our country.
It says they want to control that gate.
Yes.
That gateway.
That's right. They want to control that mechanism. So they've had domination of the economic machinery that's been used to transform the world towards this system of technocracy.
What happens to trilateral members if they join the United States government?
Well, they put them on a holding list. They say this is actually on their membership list. They say former members in public service. And after they're done with public service, then they just go back on the main list again, by and large. So yeah, it's kind of a sham. I mean, they all, if you question any of them in office, they would say, oh, well, nobody that's in office can belong to the Trilateral Commission. So they just put them on another part of their list, former members in public service. But they don't have any association, you understand, while they're in public office. It's pretty thin.
What's the difference between a Trilateral Commission and an ISIS training camp?
Well,
Al-Qaeda.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
yeah. In one sense, there's not a lot of difference, but still, it's the idea is a few people taking their ideas and shoving it down other people's throat.
Can you tell me a little bit about the trilateral publication, The Crisis in Democracy?
Wow, specifically?
It doesn't have to be specific, just its role in history, because it was one of the early papers floated out there.
Specifically, it's been a long time since I reviewed Crisis in Democracy, but the effect that it had was that that democracy as a political institution was outdated and it needed to be replaced. They didn't say exactly how it would be replaced, but Brzezinski wrote about this in his book Between Two Ages too. He said that the nation state is really being controlled by actors that are the banks and the banksters and the multinational corporations, not Congress made up of 600 odd people. And these people really believe that democracy and that the republic form of government was completely outmoded for the coming technotronic era. And that was one book that just chipped away at those foundations. And we still see the same philosophy today. Nation state is bad. If you're a kind of a nation stater today, why you're likely to be labeled a nativist. That's the term of derision for people who. Well, you're a nativist. Well, what the heck? What does that mean? Well, I don't know. I'm a native here, I guess.
Is there any evidence that the Trilateral Commission seeks to suppress news at its source?
Well, they've done that pretty effectively over the decades. There were many members of the Trilateral Commission in the early days that were allowed to go to the meetings, but they were not allowed to disseminate information on what happened in the meetings. Like Time Magazine, for instance, Hedley Donovan was a member of the Trilateral Commission. He was the chairman, he was the head of Time. You've had people from New York Times, from the major news networks, from Wall Street Journal, instrumental people in the media. Fareed Zakaria right now is a member of the Trilateral Commission. He's been busted for plagiarism 3 or 4 times. Somehow he's still on CNN. I don't know how this works, but he's a member of the Trilateral Commission, and he likes to interview all of his trilateral cronies on his program. So Rockefeller bragged about the media in 1998 in his book, and he thanked the media for being very discreet over the decades to not release the core goals. That's why they viewed Sutton as such a threat, by the way, because Sutton caught on to this game and was exposing it left and right, and they didn't want that. It was too early. And it may be, interesting enough, it may be that today I might not get any resistance whatsoever because they figure, hey, the horse is out of the barn, guys. We don't care what you say now. We don't care who knows. So.
But at that time, Antony Sutton was working at Stanford Institute, or the Hoover Institute for War and Revolution Research?
War, Peace, and Revolution, yeah.
Can you recount how your co-author at that time got fired by David Packard, and why?
Well, according to Tony, the research that he was doing was zeroing in on this group. He was, and you remember his backdrop, what his claim to fame was, he literally wrote the book on the transfer of technology from the West to the East. His technology series written during the 60s were just seminal works, still are, as a matter of fact, throughout the world. And he was the guy also that wrote the book Bolshevik, or the Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And he documented totally how the Wall Street crowd had supported and aided and abetted and enabled these movements, these revolutions to take place and Nazi Germany to take place. They were damning books, they really were, but they were so meticulously documented that nobody could argue against them. There was just nothing you could say other than grinding your teeth and saying, I hate you, I hate you. It's about all I could do. So when Tony started to zero in on this group, the Trilateral Commission, because many of them were the same people he'd written out before, he started to smell a rat, especially when they started stacking the deck in the Carter administration. He said, oh man, he knew that there was something going on. And Sutton was pretty clever about picking up on patterns of things, more so than just a smoking gun by itself. He understood how to look for patterns in society and patterns in business and stuff. And he started to write, do research and write about this group, the Trilateral Commission. And he had not published anything as yet. But David Packard picked up on his research, because word got around. And Packard was a member of the Trilateral Commission. That was David Packard that founded Hewlett-Packard, by the way, a giant electronic company. And, Packard, I'm sure, consulted with other people maybe in the organization, but said basically Sutton has to go. If we cut him off at the knees and force him out on the street, he'll no longer have access to research facilities like the quality of which we have at the Hoover Institution, which is worth a gold mine to somebody like Sutton.
Yeah.
Nor will he have access to publishing any books, because we're not going to put our imprimatur on his books. And so, he basically, as a scholar, his life was just done. And very clever on their part to see the threat that Sutton posed early on and get rid of him. Sutton was out for a bit of revenge when we teamed up together, by the way. He said, I'm not going to let him get away with this. And so he became an example of early whistleblower in a sense.
Well, they took his meticulous nature of research as a threat, and then they jettisoned him, and he's like, well, what's this all about? Why am I out here on the outside of society? They shut down his Hoover. You guys start the newsletter. Tell me about the newsletter and how you guys, first started comparing notes, then doing something structured that actually reached other people.
Yeah, we met by accident or by divine appointment, depending on your point of view, at a gold conference in New Orleans. Both of us had traveled there. I from Arizona, he from California. We happened to be seated at the same table for breakfast. That was the way they were serving breakfast. You sit where they tell you if you want to eat, and we did. And so we started talking, and before too long, he had told me his story, and I told him some of my story, and we talked about the Trilateral Commission, what was going on, and we knew immediately that it was a huge story. He'd already figured out more than I had. What I knew, I couldn't talk to anybody about. I mean, what am I going to say to him, I had thoughts, and I had serious thoughts, but I was afraid really that I didn't have confidence, to bring it up. But after Sutton told me what he knew, I said, oh man, this is like, I feel like I'm sitting on a keg of dynamite here, and it's about to blow. The fuse is lit, it's about to blow. We got to do something about this, Tony. And I was in the publishing business at the time. I had a printing operation in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I was printing newsletters and some books and pamphlets, stuff like that, commercially. And Tony was a guy who had all the thoughts, and he needed somebody to publish for him. So I said, look, let's do a newsletter together. Let's start it. Let's call it Trilateral Observer. And he said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. We shook hands, and that's how we began. I said, we're going to do this. So he started writing. I started getting the presses ready, designing the newsletter, whatever. And we marketed by direct mail. And at one point we had several thousand subscribers to it. Of course, we couldn't do it for free. We weren't rich, neither of us were. But we sold the newsletter for a reasonable amount. And we did enough research over a period of about a little over a year where we had enough material to publish our first book, which became Trilaterals over Washington, Volume 1. And then later, a couple years later, we did Volume 2 on the same basis.
What's the status of Volume 3?
Volume 3 is all contained in Technocracy Rising. That's everything you need to know. I would have loved to have titled it Trilaterals over Washington, Volume 3. But in the context that this is a global issue now, it's not appropriate. Everybody in the world is in the same boat. And it's interesting that of the first purchasers of Technocracy Rising, I was shocked to find people in Australia buying the book. I don't know anybody else. Never been to Australia. New Zealand, Brazil, Argentina, Denmark, Great Britain, Germany, Ireland. All these countries start popping up on our order sheet. I'm thinking, what on earth is going on here? There's people watching this topic all over the world, and they caught wind of Technocracy Rising, and they gobbled up the book because, and this is kind of a sad footnote to this, all these different countries are looking to us to save the world. This is humbling and it's sad at the same time because it puts a lot of pressure on us. They're already gone and done. They know they can't do anything about it in their countries. And since America, kind of did all this in the first place, screwed up the rest of the world, they're looking now to the people, the quote unquote, the patriots in our country, and others too maybe, but those who are still constitutionally minded, who see through this stuff, to somehow throw a monkey wrench into this global technocracy and thereby save the world. I don't necessarily, and I'm not saying we can do that. I don't know. I have nothing to promise them other than the fact that we put this information out. I'm hoping that there are enough Americans that might wake up and take this information and do something with it. But I myself, I'm no general, I'm no commander of thousands or whatever that I can, stand up and make a movement and, cause anything substantive to happen. I still have a margin of faith in the American people. There are a lot of intelligent people out there that are able to do things. If they were properly motivated, they might be able to rise up and actually have an impact to push technocracy back into the last century where it belongs.
I think Sutton, through his mosaic of books, because he wrote in so many different areas. He wrote in the Federal Reserve, he wrote on Skull and Bones, he writes on the Wall Street trilogy where it's the Nazis are being funded, the Bolsheviks are being funded. How familiar are you with his body of work? Did you, after working with him with the Trilateral Commission, did you say, hey, what else has this guy read? What's he doing?
No, we talked about everything he ever wrote about in some detail, and Tony's writings were all economically minded, every one of them. That's what got him on to the to the Bolshevik Revolution issue. It was an economic issue. They were making money. Wall Street people were making money on it. So he understood it in those terms. The only book that he wrote that didn't have a direct economic influence to it was his book Skull and Bones. And he would never have written that book had not a friend of his given him a body of knowledge or a body of information, documents and so on from the Skull and Bones that had been inherited by a member of Skull and Bones, or from a member of the Skull and Bones. They saved all their documents and stuff in a lockbox. This person ended up inheriting them. It scared that person a little bit, saying, what am I going to do with this? And so the documents got offered to Tony. He said, would you like to have all these secret documents on Skull and Bones? And he said, well, yeah, I'd love to look at it. And he did. And he immediately saw a book in it. But it didn't have an economic influence at the beginning. It was just something he felt like needed to be written about. And it, quite honestly, is something you can make a buck on. It was something nobody had written on, and he thought, oh, there's a story here, I'll write it. And he did. But I will say generally after, and this is no disrespect to Tony really, but after probably 1985 or so, Tony's research really went downhill as far as new material is concerned. It wasn't all his fault because research takes money. You got to travel, you got to have per diem expenses and stuff covered when you travel. You know how it is when you travel. And he wasn't working for a major university, would just give him a travel pass to go where he wanted to go. So he really didn't have the financial resources to do any really, really big projects on original research like he did in his early career. And that showed in his work, in his books, the writings and stuff that he had. He just didn't have the bulk of material behind him that he would have liked to have had.
Do you know the name of the individual who provided him with that information about Skull and Bones?
I do. I'm not telling.
All right. I interviewed her.
That's fine.
All right,
you can say it.
That's all good.
You can say it, but I'm not. just because.
All righty, where are we at here? We're almost down through these questions. Yeah, because that would I would have just said Charlotte Iserbyt providing those documents to Sutton also ties into Common Core, like what she's talking about with the Soviet and American systems being merged. Like, yeah, that is definitely an agenda.
Yes, and by the way, those were Brzezinski's exact terms. He called the Technotronic era the merging of the American communist transformation or whatever. The exact words he used. And that's pretty much exactly what's happened.
Do you remember what Brzezinski had to say about Sutton?
You know, I don't remember specifically. I do vaguely remember he said something about Sutton. Tell me what he said.
I believe it's in Between Two Ages, and I don't remember the page number, but it's a footnote. Okay. And he said, if you really want insight into Western interventional, Soviet technology, the scholar is Sutton.
Okay.
Now, later on, they use Sutton's name to marginalize people. It's like, oh, you read Sutton, and you're a fringe person. And it's like, hey, Brzezinski's talking about him. He read Sutton. Yeah. He found it valuable. Yeah. Do you happen to know who wrote the Earth Charter?
Well, the instrumental party in that was Stephen Rockefeller. And, oh, no, not another Rockefeller. Yes,
there's no pattern. There's no pattern.
Yeah, Rockefeller. That Stephen Rockefeller is a very core member of the Rockefeller family, and he was a theologian by education. He was very much one of the initiators of the interfaith movement, which now has traction throughout the world. And the fact that all of the major denominations of the world today have gone green, I think we can probably safely say that Stephen Rockefeller somewhere had a hand in that in almost every case. And so the the Earth Charter was part and parcel of that. But even the Catholic Church now is deeply, deeply embedded in global and climate change. The Pope has said he's going to issue a major encyclical in June on climate change. This is in preparation for the big meeting next November that the United Nations is having on climate change. And all of the other religions, the major religions of the world, if you go and look at their website, you'll see that they're green. All is talking about sustainable development, about global stewardship,
sustainable planning, sustainable development.
Planning and sustainable development. All these terms are being thrown around, and they've been completely co-opted. I'm sure they don't recognize how they've been co-opted, but they have been. And so, if you take the Catholic Church, Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church, all the major Christian denominations, they're all embedded in it. And it's also interesting to see that Islam is also embedded in it as well, just as heavily. That is agreeing everything.
If I had to think of a connection between that, I'd say World Council of Churches, the Dulles brothers, and St. John Philby, because that was like they were running the Arab Nazis together. There's a whole line of thought, and I want to talk about your interview with Martin Erdman in a couple questions. Then let me forget that.
But before that, let me mention before we get off the Nazi connection here. I have a friend whose name is, he's an author, his name is Mark Musser, Musser, and Mark has written a book some time ago called Nazi Oaks, and it's about the green connection in Nazi socialism. Stunning book. It's just a fantastically well-documented book on the green agenda that existed in Nazi Germany. And if Hitler had been alive during the Brundtland Commission, he would have cheered the term sustainable development. He just didn't beat him to it. But there is a distinct connection of the green movement today with the green movement that existed in Nazi Germany at the time that existed nowhere else in the world, by the way. It was in the mindset of technocracy, but it had never yet been put up on a national level like it was in Nazi Germany. Just a sidebar.
Oh, I got the lights on you now.
Where were you?
Where were you on July 27th, 1979? Do you recall, sir?
No, I don't. What happened?
I think you were on an Iowa radio station. I only know this because I read your appendix.
Okay, that's fine.
Appendix 3, I think, or Appendix 2.
That's right. That's where I was.
George S. Franklin.
Yeah.
You and Dr. Sutton had a little conversation with the gentleman. You happened to transcribe it.
Yeah.
Do you recall anything of that discussion?
Well, we had debated several members of the Trilateral Commission over a period of time, and we did it on the basis of, hey, point, counterpoint, let's get these people out to play, so to speak, get them in the public eye. Radio hosts went along with it on a local basis, local markets, and we'd find out where these people lived, and we'd call radio stations till we found somebody that'd be willing to do a little point-counterpoint argument debate. And we found somebody in that city, and they contacted George Franklin. He agreed to come on the air with us. And Sutton was on remotely by phone. I was on remotely by phone, and I think Franklin was as well. And we had a long discussion about trilateralism. We asked him questions. He evaded almost every one. But it certainly revealed a mindset that was the reason we transcribed it, because it totally revealed this paternalistic mindset. Like, run along, little boy. You're asking childish questions, sort of thing. And either you're not equipped to understand our sophisticated answers, or maybe you just shouldn't ask that question in the first place. So all the substantive questions we asked him, he dodged. And it was obvious that he dodged them, even to the radio host at the time. It's like, give me a straight answer, would you?
I was pretty impressed for a 1970s Iowa radio show with the content of that show. I mean, it's very substantial content. During the Carter administration, you and Dr. Sutton did about 350 radio interviews leading up to Larry King. Tell me about your Larry King appearance and the experience with Charles Heck of the Trilateral Commission.
Charles Heck was the executive director of the commission at that time. He was not a member. He was like the executive director, the guy, the CEO or whatever, not herding him around, but taking care of all the business affairs.
Yeah.
But he came on as a spokesman for the Trilateral Commission. Larry King agreed to have us on for 1 hour, the first hour of the program. He was on Mutual Broadcasting Network at the time. It was overnight radio. It was the biggest show in the nation by far. And it was a 3-hour program. He only wanted us for 1 hour, so I flew back there to New York City for a 1-hour show. This sounds kind of nuts, but we figured, hey, it's a good opportunity. We'll go back and do it. And Charles Heck showed up in the studio. I sat across the table from him. Larry King was on the end with all the radio microphones and stuff around. And we started the program. It was all a call-in program. That's what kind of made Larry King Larry King. He let people call in. And so Charles Heck would say something about the Trilateral Commission. I might say something. And then, hello, caller, what's your point, whatever. The callers were universally angry for the whole time. They'd call in and just, whatever, they'd take exception to what poor old Charles Heck was saying, and they'd just rat him and throw eggs at him and rotten tomatoes, and, I don't know, I guess they had a curse button so they could, or a delay, so they cut out the cursing. But after the caller was done, it afforded me an opportunity to set the record straight that the caller invariably would have either bad information or it was skewed information. I said, well, it's not quite like that. It's really like this. And then I would just simply quote what they had written maybe in the Trilogue magazine or whatever, take it right out of their stuff. Laying out the truth was more damaging than what the caller could ever have done, but in a sense it defended Charles Heck. Because every word he said, people got mad at him. And so we're supposed to have a 1-hour show. It turned into a 3-hour program. Larry King, it was so hot, Larry King could not stop the mic. And he just kept going. We went for 3 solid hours. Phone call after phone call after phone call, same MO all the way along the way. Caller would be irate, yelling and screaming and hopping up and down, you could tell. And Charles Heck couldn't defend, and then I'd jump in and kind of set the record straight on what the guy was really trying to say. Well, no, this is what the Trilateral Commission really said. And, of course, Charles Heck couldn't dispute that because it comes right out of their publication. And in the end of it, Charles Heck viewed my role in the debate as actually defending him from these angry callers, and he thanked me for it. And Larry King ended the show. He's a liberal, totally liberal, progressive mind. And he merely, as he shook our hands and ushered us out the door, the only thing he could do was shake his head and say, I've never seen anything like this in my life. That's what he said. I've never seen anything like this in my life. And he thanked us for coming, and off we went. And it was still the middle of the night, and I was going to take another red eye back to Phoenix. And so Charles Heck and I went to breakfast together down at Denny's. And we had a nice conversation. He thanked me for, helping him out, so to speak, defend him from these bad people. I don't know that he ever really caught on that I was, doing him more damage than he could have ever done to himself. And it just kind of went over his head, the whole thing just kind of went over his head. But it was an interesting show, and it was clearly the pinnacle of our radio work in those days, and there's no place higher to go. Never got invited on again. We did get a frantic phone call the next day from B. Dalton Booksellers to get a stocking order for books. They said, we don't know what you said last night on Larry King, but man, we got orders all over the country for your book. And could you express us some copies? We'd like to review it. We want to place a stocking order to get, all over the country. And I'm thinking, ka-ching, ka-ching, we're going to finally get some serious book sales. And a couple of weeks later, they still hadn't called me back. I finally broke, and I called them, and they said, well, we're not going to carry your book, but we might special order it, but we're not going to carry it. And I said, why not? They didn't give me a reason. They just said, well, that's our business decision. And so before too long, we found out that they had sent out a memo to every store in the nation that said that the book was out of print and the publisher was out of business. And so we were officially blacklisted completely by B. Dalton Bookseller. We found out after that, Tony did a little digging around and found out that the parent of B. Dalton was Dayton Corporation, which is now Target, owns Target. Dayton had a director who was a member of the Trilateral Commission. So we figured, kibosh, put the cough button down on that guy, just not going to do it. And so we went on some more radio shows after that and had a little bit of fun digging B. Dalton on having blacklisted us. We'd suggest to the host that they should just call up the local store and see what they say. And they first say, oh, this is America. Nobody blackballs books in America. This is free speech land. So yeah, okay, if that's true, then try and get our book. Call them on the phone, see if you can order it. And they'd do it, and you shuffle, and you hear the clerk going through it, and the papers, and invariably they come back and say, well, I'm sorry, sir, but I have a note here that the book is out of print, the publisher's out of business. And the radio host would say, but that's really strange. I've got the author of the book in my studio right now, and he says that the book is still in print and his publisher is still in business. What do you say to that? Well, of course it's just a clerk. They got nothing to say. But just a job, they're making minimum wage. But we found this all across the country that this memo had gone out, and B. Dalton literally just killed our book sales and all of our momentum that we had going from the Larry King show. And we had no way to reach those people, by the way, that were the victims of it, that went to the store, tried to buy it. All they heard was the book's out of print, the publisher's out of business. But we had no way to contact them, to tell them differently at that point.
So you were mentioning that you have joined this elite club, this very small club of authors who have had their book blacklisted for political purposes. You and Sutton, I believe Carol Quigley also details how they told him it was out of print and his publisher lied to him, and then he found out the Council on Foreign Relations owned Macmillan. It's just like it happens over and over again when good information is meticulously researched. They want to put the kibosh on it. They want to drop that term like conspiracy theory. There was an FBI memo back in '68 when Ed Epstein had written his book about the Warren Commission, and they said, hey, how can we take this down a notch? And they're like, use this term conspiracy theorist. They did something different with you guys. They focused a popular situational comedy, Barney Miller, and they had this up-and-coming actor Jeffrey Tambor talk about the Trilateral Commission. How accurate is what they put in that script to reality?
It was very, very accurate. They dropped out a few pieces of information. They didn't mention Zbigniew Brzezinski's name as being a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, but they did mention David Rockefeller, and they lampooned him, so to speak, as being the big global dictator wannabe, bugaboo, whatever. And but by and large, the guy's claims were pretty accurate. And if they were not accurate, there would be no ability to discredit our work, because it was almost like they took some of our work verbatim and put it in this guy's mouth. But it made fun of this guy that was complaining about the Trilateral Commission and just, joked around and says, well, that's ridiculous, it's a, wild tinfoil hat conspiracy-oriented people. We had a number of attacks like that, though. That was one that came through Hollywood, which is really interesting. But we had others as well. The criticism was always that people criticizing the Trilateral Commission are either far left or far right. Weirdos, like Hillary Clinton says, the vast right-wing conspiracy. Nothing could be further from the truth, but they always declared themselves to be the moderate middle, bar none. And so another attack, interestingly, came with the publication of another book by a far-left organization on the Trilateral Commission that included in it a ton of misinformation about a lot of truth, but a lot of misinformation about the Trilateral Commission as well. And so that gave credence to their criticism. Well, it either comes from the far left or the far right. So they identified the far left, and then they would just kind of hint at us being on the far right. But they marginalized us. That was the key. They marginalized our work and our efforts. Then we had the Barney Millen thing come along. Then we had the blacklisting come along by Beat-All booksellers. And by the time they were done with us, we were pretty much done for that inning in any case. And when Ronald Reagan got elected, of course, all of the conservative movement just laid down and rolled over, figuring the cavalry had arrived, and they don't need to fight anything anymore. They just got done, getting beat to death with Jimmy Carter. And, they just were so exhausted, I guess, maybe with all the emotional ups and downs of the Carter administration, they figure, oh man, we're done with this. We're back on an even keel again. Little did they know that the trouble had only just begun. They didn't know.
I really enjoyed your interviews on the Mind Renewed podcast with Dr. Martin Erdman. How does the World Council of Churches play into technocracy, or does it run parallel? How is it laid out on the board?
No, this was really an effort, I think, of people like Stephen Rockefeller and his religious crowd to convince the church organizations that they need to embrace sustainable development. Exactly how he did it, I wouldn't really want to venture, but there they are. The World Council is leading the charge. The National Council of Churches is leading the charge. The whole various interfaith movements are leading the charge. It's everywhere. It's incredible. And in fact, there's a book published called Green Faith that talks about the whole religious makeup of the world now. It's turned green.
It is a new faith. It's a new belief system that goes across borders. I mean, when H.G. Wells wanted to create a new world religion, what could it be? Could it be technocracy?
Yeah. It could certainly be scientism, if not technocracy. Scientism is the basis for technocracy and for transhumanism as well. They're like Siamese twins, if you will, joined at the hip. And scientism is very much a religion. The God is science. The priesthood is a science and engineers. And in a very real sense, the priests climb up the mountain of science, listen carefully into the volcano, whatever, to hear what science is saying. And then they come down and they share that with the rest of us who don't get the privilege of seeing for ourselves what science had to say, or the documentation for whether it's truthful or not. But they come down the mountain and they say, well, and I might say they come down the mountain with the tablets, inscribed with whatever we need to do. And they say, thus saith the God of science. You will do this or that. And the people go, are you sure that's what the God of science said? Yep, we're sure. Hey, don't question us. We're the priesthood here, man. You didn't go up the mountain. We went up the mountain. And if you don't obey the God of science, you better look out, because you're going to get punished. That's what gods do when they're angry. They punish the people. And we can see this priesthood religion played out going all the way back to St. Simon in the 1800s, early 1800s. all the way through technocracy, all the way through the modern movement of transhumanism as well. And it's basically science is the new God, and we should all do our homage to the God of science and not question what the God of science says. At least that's certainly what Al Gore would say, right? He says, of course you must believe the way I believe, and if you don't, we can be sure you deserve to be punished. So don't be surprised when you get punished.
I think people are enamored with transhumanism, the singularity that Kurzweil has written about, the fact that Kurzweil is working at Google, the fact that Google says don't be evil and yet they're acting evil. There's another ominous continuity trickling down. Transhumanism seeks to use the technology to basically eradicate death and live forever.
That's right.
What is the purpose of death in this life? Does it have a purpose?
The purpose of death?
Well, we as human beings experience birth and death. Mm-hmm. These people are trying to avoid part of that natural cycle.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that take the meaning away from everything? Because if life is never ending, then those moments don't have as much value.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Yeah, a lot of people would say that. The whole movement of transhumanism and scientism in general is very exclusionary to any concept of God. On one hand, it has a flavor of atheism to it, but not atheism. I don't want to tag it like that. The people within the transhuman movement very much believe that they are going to become gods themselves. So in that sense, how can you be an atheist if you're saying you're going to become a god? Well, I believe in myself, but I don't believe in anybody else becoming God. Well, you get the point. It's kind of it's got some fuzzy walls around it. And the transhumans, some of them are very outspoken about this, and they say, we won't have any trouble until, if you meddle with me becoming God, you're gonna have warfare, Buster. And it's radical stuff, to hear them say stuff like that. But they do, and this competes with the whole concept of God, at least the God of the Bible, the God of creation, and also the fall of man that prescribed that death would be a feature of mankind, until God wraps up history at some time in the future. The Bible says, the New Testament says very clearly, it's appointed for a man once to die, and then comes the judgment. That's the way God appointed things, and these people are making an end run around, what the God of the Bible says, and so, okay, fine. You can try all you want, but the odds are pretty high that you're not going to be successful.
That's an interesting point, because it brings the notion that the mass surveillance society is competing with God. They're saying, no, we can be the overseer of everything. We can be the master. So what are the parallels that you see between the GCHQ, NSA, building these huge data farms to store everybody's everything for basically forever?
Yeah.
This
is an expression and a necessity. It's an expression of technocracy. It's a necessity for technocracy to operate. They must have a monitoring system in place in order to engineer the social engine, the social mechanism. I don't put any other criteria on collecting data other than that. And here's my proof, or here's my reasoning on it anyway. The intelligence community in America was completely revamped in 2005 by George W. Bush. He was the guy that signed into law the so-called requirement for the Office of Director of National Intelligence to be implemented. The ODNI would take authority and control over all 17 agencies of the country, the intelligence agencies. He received line item budget control over every agency. He was charged with restructuring the agencies to all work together as one. And he was given incredible powers to orchestrate all these changes in our intelligence system. Well, it's interesting that the legislation that was presented to Congress to authorize the president to do this, was sponsored by Dianne Feinstein and J. Rockefeller, both of whom were members of the Trilateral Commission. Interesting. And then George Bush said, that's a great idea, whatever. He didn't veto it. And he established the office of the ODNI, or the DNI, Director of National Intelligence. The first person that he assigned to that super important role was John Negroponte. You can say a lot about John Negroponte in a bad sense, stuff he did in South America, whatever. He's always had a cloud around his head on bad stuff he's done. Pushing all that aside, John Negroponte was a member of the Trilateral Commission. So here you have the law was proposed by members of the Trilateral Commission. The position was filled by a member of the Trilateral Commission. And so when the whole intelligence network of our nation got reorganized, who did it? Who was the one responsible for doing it? A Trilateral Commission member. In other words, did they orchestrate the intelligence community to serve the American people in any way, shape, or form? Or did they do it to serve themselves? And if they did, what was the purpose? We've already established the purpose to create a new international economic order as technocracy. We've already done that. We don't have to lay that groundwork again. But the DNI became singularly responsible for every intelligence agency. In fact, I found documentation that refers to the NSA merely as an agent of the DNI.
Yeah.
That changes everything. That means the NSA is not a rogue organization. It means it's completely co-opted into the authority of the DNI, who's calling all the shots, who have been members of the Trilateral Commission. You see, they're setting up their monitoring network, is what they're doing for the whole system, not just here but around the world as well. And this is unmistakably a trilateral operation that we have going on right here. And seeing it in that context makes a lot of difference in understanding how close we are to implementing technocracy. And coming from a computer background myself and professionally, as I understand it, what I can tell you is they become very good at collecting information, vacuuming it up from all parts of society. You've got Obamacare, you've got Common Core sucking up information on the kids. You've got all of the other, all the financial records, the co-opting of telephone calls, of emails, all that kind of stuff. It's all going in a master database. They've learned how to collect things very well. All the fusion centers around the country are collecting information. They've learned how to collect it and store it. But computer technology has grown in that area. The collection and data storage has grown radically in the last 10 years. What has not grown is their ability to analyze the data. We can say thank goodness for that. They don't have the horsepower nor the software available yet to appropriately analyze all the data they're collecting at a breakneck speed. However, it's estimated by their own admission, 3 to 5 years they're going to solve that problem, where they will have enough artificial intelligence, computing power, enough supercomputer power. And it's not just the issue of analyzing a given body of data, but it's moving the data from the storage devices into the CPUs to process. That moving that's the bottleneck right now, is moving the data from one place to another and then putting it back again, if necessary. But they're 3 to 5 years now away from having the processing power to analyze that data to tell them what it means. Then we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. In Miami, just this last week, they're implementing a pre-crime division. Think in terms of the movie Minority Report. This is scary stuff.
Yeah, they see someone do a Google search on their iPhone, they go to a store and buy a hammer or whatever, and the next thing you know, they're like, hey, this is pre-crime, because the artificial intelligence is using time series analysis and sucking in everybody's everything, learning everyone's patterns, and when it sees you deviate from the pattern, it sends an alert to someone's cell phone.
And it's very rudimentary at this point, granted. But even according to Kurzweil's theory of processing capacity and memory doubles about every 18 months, they're not very far away from having the capacity and the algorithms, programs, to analyze the data pretty much in a real-time fashion.
Right.
And when that happens, life is going to change in our country for the worse. And this is an expression of technocracy. It's an expression of the Trilateral Commission hegemony over our country for the last 40 years.
What you mentioned earlier about Negroponte made me think about their pedigree. Like, where does a guy like Negroponte, how does he get to be in that position? Well, he was in Yale, he graduated Yale. His brother went to Le Rosey, which was the School of Kings in Switzerland, where, like, you know, other kings get schooled, right? So his family is like technocrats / royalty, and he was in a secret society. It wasn't Skull and Bones. I think maybe it was Scroll and Key with Porter Goss and William H.T. Bucky Bush. And those guys had a rise to fame after 9/11. Porter Goss definitely had a rise to fame. Negroponte definitely had a rise to fame. And Bucky Bush is a war prophet here. So it's not just the Trilateral Commission. There's the Yale. There's the layering of how they make someone who joins the Trilateral or who gets chosen by the Trilateral Commission members. Right? And so I think that what you have is a pedigree being built through university and then membership in a club like the CFR Bilderberg. And then if you do really good in there and you keep your mouth shut, then you can be in the Trilateral Commission. If you do really good, they'll let you out of that and you can be in government. And I can't help but notice that Zbigniew Brzezinski today is an advisor to our current so-called president. Do you have any comment on that ominous continuity there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And he bragged about it, that he was foreign policy advisor for Barack Hussein Obama. Yeah. Yeah, makes you wonder, how come they keep showing up, you know? At every turn, they keep showing up. That's not by accident. I asked a math guy one time, a math PhD, is it possible to calculate any odds of this small organization having this much influence over government over a period of 40 years? He said it's incalculable. There's no computer on earth that can calculate the odds.
So what does that mean?
It means it's on purpose. That's all.
It's a rigged game.
It means it's a rigged game. They took over, they hijacked our executive branch in 1976, period, of the subject. They have not let go ever since. Every administration has been dominated by these people, and they've used their positions to push forward their agenda of an interdependent world and of a new international economic order. That's it. And we now know that the new international economic order is pure, unadulterated technocracy from the 1930s. I'd also like to mention at this point just an observation about the global elite. These people, in my estimation, are really pedestrian academics at best. They have never come up with an original idea of their own. They have to hijack other people's ideas to, to get whatever advantage they can. That was the case with technocracy. It was not their idea at all. Although they might make it seem like it wasn't their idea. We go back, goes way back. If you were to go and interview one of the original Greens from, say, the 60s, that's the long-haired, the guy now's got gray hair, right, balding, but his hair still hangs down the middle of his back, right? Go find one of those original Green guys and ask him, what's his take on what happened to the Green movement? Is he happy with it, where it turned out, or whatever? You'll find somebody spitting molten nails that they got pushed out of their own movement by these very same people. Their movement was hijacked, in other words. And the purest objectives that they had when they first started the Green movement got completely hijacked by this global elite, pushed them out, and they took off with it in a totally different direction.
Sounds like what happened with technocracy.
Yeah, they're hijackers, that's all. They take whatever idea suits them to push forward their agenda, and they use it, to whatever advantage they can. But it doesn't speak too well for their overall intellectual capabilities, does it?
Not too well.
Yeah.
Do you think the idea of the panopticon had any influence on technocracy as it's being used today?
I don't know that it did per se. I mean, conceptually, the idea of being watched is,
Yeah.
I mean, it's monitoring the population. However, in this case, it's monitoring the population automatically, systematically, using system theory and algorithms rather than people. So theoretically, if the system is set up properly in the future, no individual person needs to put his eyeballs on you to see if you're behaving. The computer will take care of you. If you're misbehaving, the computer will redirect you and rechannel you.
It has already been programmed with the patterns of people who are misbehaving, and if you match that pattern,
Yeah,
it's
and
basically out.
the system will move to correct your behavior. And if you continue to move outside the bounds, then perhaps an individual might get involved, and you might get a knock on the door. But the idea of a systematic or a scientific dictatorship is that the system does the controlling, also does the monitoring. It monitors you, it self-corrects. It monitors you, it self-corrects. And so, of all the hundreds of millions or the billions of people on the planet that are going to be involved in this system ultimately, they can all be managed and monitored in the same system and controlled and corrected in the same system without people needing to be involved.
What's the most important idea you'd like the future to grasp?
Wow. The future to grasp. In the short term, it's who the enemy is. Americans and patriots and people struggling against this whole thing for decades, I believe, have had their ladder leaning up against the wrong wall. I certainly did for a long time. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I mean, there's no point being embarrassed at this point. The cat's out of the bag. We know what they've done. We know who did it. But America will never succeed in any resistance against these people unless we clearly see who the enemy is. That kind of thinking goes all the way back to the great Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu, who said, if you don't know the enemy, you cannot possibly win the war. And we've been trying to win the war for 40 years, and we've lost. We're worse off today than we've ever been off in the last 40 years. So something has to change in America. I think that what primarily what needs to be changed is we need to see the enemy for who he really is, and then and only then can we really take and make a target out of it, if you will, to push these people out of influence in our country, if it's possible at all. That's in the near term, know the enemy. In the longer term, you'd like some vestiges, some memory of liberty to remain in the hearts of men. This might be difficult when we have none, if that's where we're headed. But be that as it is, if we lose our liberty in this country, we lose liberty generally throughout the world, people will be living in a scientific dictatorship-like society. Liberty will be historical curiosity. Only hopefully enough people will keep a seed of liberty in their heart where somewhere down the road, liberty and freedom might be able to crawl out of the dark cave back into the light of day again.
I think that was a good last question. Do you have...
You want an anecdotal story?
What do you got?
Well, I'll tell you one.
We need something for the credits while they roll.
I don't know if this will work or not, but back when during the 1980 election campaign, Ronald Reagan was campaigning against George Bush, nose to nose, fierce battle going on. And basically, whoever wins Florida, it was down to the point where whoever got Florida was going to win the nomination for the Republican ticket. And George Bush was campaigning and stumping in Florida like crazy. It was getting down to the wire for the, if he didn't win Florida, he was out. And people had been dogging him in the campaign speeches he was making with our book, Trilaterals over Washington. And you know how distinctive the colors are, red and white. It's very easy to spot from even 100 yards away. And people were holding his book up in meetings, you know, when he'd speak and ask him, "Are you a member of the Trilateral Commission?" And you know, he'd give some lame answer, or whatever, and just move on. And but people were quoting other things. Well, is it true the Trilateral Commission does blah blah blah, whatever? He didn't like to answer those questions. Needless to say, his last stumping speech was in Dade County, Florida, and somebody held up a book and started asking a question, and he did a complete meltdown. Turned beet red, started yelling, cursing at the guy. He snapped. He just couldn't take it anymore. You people with, you know, whatever. You probably watched the Barney Miller episode the night before or something. He was hollering at this guy, and he got so angry, he just ended up walking out. And that lost him the nomination. That last speech, he gave up, he just stomped out. And the next morning, the local newspaper there had a headline, "Have you ever seen a burning bush?"
That's priceless.
Oh yeah, but you know what? Barney Miller was right, because when it got to the Republican the RNC, you know, at the convention, Bush was not expected to even be water boy. At that point, he was totally discredited, and everybody universally said, "Man, this guy's not. You know, he's out. Thank God, he's out of the whole thing." Henry Kissinger waltzed in essentially at the convention and strong-armed the Reagan team and says, "It's going to be Bush." As a member, you know, the member of the Trilateral Commission, it's going to be Bush. And lo and behold, flip-flop, it's Reagan-Bush.
Wow.
And that's how Bush got in. Just that simple. You know, the big boys came in and said, this is it, folks. You take them or else you won't like the outcome. So that continued the Trilateral legacy right through the Bush administration and through Clinton and Gore and through Bush Jr. and with Dick Cheney.
There's an ominous continuity between World War II, because Nelson Rockefeller worked in psychological warfare. Henry Kissinger was picked up and recruited in through that special group, and then that all comes forward. So when you see, Prescott Bush had been financing Nazis, and Nixon, that's how he came to power in the 50s, is he was with the Navy when he was going through, and he found these Justice Department memos, and he's like, hey, wait a minute, Operation Paperclip, and Dulles said, let me help you with your campaign. Yep. So it's just, all these layers can't be realized in context till someone like you does all this research. And it's like, you've heard these names before, but now here's the context, here's how they fit into a story of history that applies to billions of people around the world. Your latest book, Technocracy Rising, puts it in a very coherent order where it's not written above the average individual's ability to understand, but it is written at a point high enough where you can really respect it and dig into the references and find out for yourself if what you're saying is accurate. And I think when you compare the statements, the declarative statements made in that book to our reality, it has a very, very high recognition rate where it matches up. So what I'm saying is that's a very artful description of our reality. I think it's going to be long-lasting, even though people are going to outgrow this part and we're going to learn about freedom, and we're not going to let these guys rule over everything forever. We are at a point in history where it's in question. Mm-hmm. The right and left side of the teeter-totter is not being balanced toward the middle at all, and something's going to happen if we don't do something as individuals. So Patrick, I would like to thank you for spending so much time today, not only 3 hours this morning on the radio, but the several hours here in Ernie's dining room. It's been an honor and a privilege.
I appreciate your time and talent to put it together. It's good.
Armageddon.